1. Introductory in the 9th edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, supervised by so eminent a scholar and hierologist as the late Professor Robertson Smith, as against some hundreds of pages on the books of the Bible, there was devoted to the subject of the ancient Persian deity Mithra or Mithras, and his cultus, 1 column. All the while, Mithraism was well known to have been the chief rival to Christianity in the ancient world. Within the past dozen years there has taken place a great improvement in the sense of proportion among the cultivators of hierology, and the study of Mithraism, in particular, has been conducted with a zeal and a competence which leave little opening for new contributions. The present survey, first undertaken over 20 years ago, is an attempt to elucidate, in the light of comparative science, what is likely to remain an obscure problem. When all is said, we have but a fragmentary knowledge of Mithraism. But we do know that it was during some centuries the most widespread of the religious systems of the Roman Empire. That is to say, Mithraism was in point of range the most nearly universal religion of the Western world in the early centuries of the Christian era. As to this, students are agreed. 1391 to the early fathers, we shall see, Mithraism was a most serious thorn in the flesh, and the monumental remains of the Roman period, in almost all parts of the empire, show its extraordinary extension. In our own country, held by the Romans for 300 years at a time when Christianity is supposed to have penetrated the whole imperial world, there have been found no signs whatever of any Roman profession of the Christian faith, while there are a number of monuments in honor of Mithra. 1392 there has been found, for instance, a Mithraic cave 1393 at Housesteads, in Northumberland, containing sculptures of Mithra worship, and an inscription, to the god, best and greatest, invincible Mithra, Lord of Ages, 1394 and another at Chichester, with an inscription, to the god the sun, the invincible Mithra, the Lord of Ages. Other monuments have been found at Chester, on the line of the Roman wall, at Cambeckford in Cumberland, at Oxford, at York 1395 and at London and Manchester. 1396 and Mithraic bas-reliefs, cut upon the smoothed faces of rocks, or upon tablets of stone, still abound throughout the former western provinces of the Roman Empire. Many exist in Germany, still more in France. 1397 according to Mr. King, again, the famous Arthur's Urn, destroyed in the 18th century, upon the Carron, a hemispherical vaulted building of immense blocks of stone, was unmistakably a Spicus Mithraeum, the same in design as Chosroes' magnificent fire temple at Gazaka. But in other lands the remains of Mithraic shrines are far more numerous. They abound in the Alps, in southern France, in eastern Italy, in Dalmatia, in Dacia, in many Mediterranean ports, and though their distribution is unequal, they signify that the cult went wherever went the legions and the Syrian traders who followed them. And yet, with all this testimony to the vogue of Mithraism in the early Christian centuries, there ensues for a whole era an absolute blank in the knowledge of the matter in Christendom, 1,000 years in which the ancient cultus seems a forgotten name in Europe. One modern investigator, M. Lajard, 1398 thinks that since the time of the Fathers the first in European literature to mention Mithra was Pietro Riccio, Petrus Crinitus, 1399 born about 1465, disciple of Politian, and no other mention occurs till about the middle of the 16th century. 1400 such was the ignorance of most scholars, that of 3 now well-known Mithraic monuments discovered about that period, not one is attributed to Mithra either by the great antiquarian of the time, Rossi, or by his pupil, Flaminius Vaca. Every one knows the sculptured group of Mithra slaying the bull, so often engraved, of which we have a good example in the British Museum. Rossi declared one of these monuments to represent Jupiter, as the bull, carrying off Europa, and Vaca tells how a lion-headed image, now known to represent Chronoservan or the time spirit in the mysteries of Mithra, but then held to represent the devil, was, probably, burned in a limekiln. 1401 a century later, Leibniz demonstrated that Ormuzd and Ahriman, the good and evil powers of the Persian system to which Mithra belonged, were simply deified heroes, and later still the historian Mosheim, a man not devoid of judgment, elaborately proved that Mithra had simply been at one time, like Nimrod, a famous hunter 1402 before the Lord or otherwise. Other 18th century scholars discussed the problem more intelligently, 1403 but even in our own day, when all the extant notices and monuments of Mithra have been carefully collected and studied, vigilant scholars 1404 confess that we know very little as to the Mithraic religion. It is somewhat remarkable that this should be so, and though in the terms of the case we cannot look to find much direct knowledge, we may hope at least to find out why the once popular cultus has fallen into such obscurity. To that end we must see what really is known about it. 2. Beginnings of cult. To trace completely the history of the cultus, however, we should have to make an examination not merely of Mithraism proper, but of at least 3 older systems. No historical principle is better established than this, that all historic religions run into and derive from some other religions, the creeds of all mankind being simply phases of a continuous evolution. So, when we say that Mithraism derives from Persia, we are already implying that it affiliates more distantly to the religions of India and Mesopotamia. Here it must suffice, therefore, to give only the briefest sketch of origins. We trace the cult specifically in the earliest Aryan documents, in the Vedas, in which the deity Mitra or Mithra is one of the prominent figures. 1405. Seeing that there already he duplicates with other deities, it may be that, to begin with, the name was only a special epithet of the sun. 1406. The central force in later myth as in our planetary system, and that it lay with the priests and their royal patrons to determine which name should be the most popular god, since the whole evolution was one of words. In any case, it is in Aryan Persia that the name of Mithra makes its fortune. In India it passes into the background of the verbal host. In the Rigveda it is frequently associated with Varuna 1407 and Agni, and in the Atharvaveda Mitra is so defined as to make his solar character certain. Of a deity who stands in general for the principle of light, it is there said that, in the evening he becomes Varuna Agni, in the morning he becomes Mitra going forth. 1408. An expression which plainly points to the sun god. That Mithra was not developed into a preeminent Vedic deity is to be proximately explained by the fact that Agni, who as fire god and light god had similar attributes, was better suited to the purposes of the highly specialized priesthood which built up the Vedas. The god of the sacrificial fire was eminently adapted to sacerdotal ends, and it is in that respect that Agni is oftenest presented. It may have been, indeed, that the Aryan invaders of India had thus early assimilated in the case of Agni a popular pre-Aryan, though not Hindu, worship 1409 as they did later with the Hindu cult of Krishna, while in Persia the Aryan gods may have had a simpler course of development. On the other hand, it seems probable that the Ahura Mazda, or Mazd, of the Persians is a variant of the Assyrian god name Asara Mazas, and at bottom identical with the god Asur or Ashur. 1410. On that view it is more likely that the Aryans were influenced by the ancient Mesopotamian cults than vice versa. 1411. However that may be, though we find the sacramental Vedic beverage the soma preserved in the Persian cult as the Haumar, that principle did not predominate, and Mithra, in the character of sun god and war god, grew in popular importance. Of Agni, as a special personification of the sacred fire, there is in the Persian system no other trace. The Iranian documents which present to us what remains of the ancient lore of Mithraism are for the most part contained in the collection called the Zendavesta, a somewhat unfortunate title, since Zend signifies, not, as was formerly supposed, a language, but a commentary or explanation, and Avesta, from Old Persian Abasta, the law, is the proper name of the original texts, of which the language somewhat resembles the modern Afghan. The collection is divided into 2 parts, of which the first is the Avesta properly so called, containing 1. The Vendidad, a compilation of religious laws and mythical tales, 2. The Visparad, a set of litanies for the sacrifice, and 3. The Yasna, consisting of other litanies and 5 hymns or gathas written in what appears to be an older dialect than the rest. The second part is called the Korda, small, Avesta, and contains short prayers for general use, namely, 5 Gar, 30 formularies of the Siroza, 3 African, and 6 Nais. It is usual to include in the Korda, though they do not strictly belong to it, the Yashts, hymns of praise to the several Izzats or lesser deities, who, however, here include Mithra, and some fragments. As to the age of the different portions there is considerable dispute. In the opinion of the late M. James Dharmastita, one of the highest authorities, certain quasi-scientific sections, Nasks, of the Avesta were written as late as the middle of the 3rd century of our era, in imitation of Greek and Sanskrit scientific treatises, 1412, and the same scholar places the important Hom Yasht late in the 2nd century. Much of the Vendidad, however, is reckoned pre-Alexandrian, and while M. Dharmastita held the Gathas to be post-Alexandrian, and very late in spirit albeit the oldest texts in the Avesta, other students count them among the earliest items of all. 1413. Broadly speaking, the religion of the Avesta, commonly called the Mazdian, from the god name Ahura Mazda, is a highly composite one, but there are few instances of foreign elements and concepts so freely borrowed by a religion and so harmoniously blended in the original mold. 1414. 3. Zoroastrianism. It is thus difficult to formulate precisely the evolution of Mithraism. If the Gathas are really the oldest parts of the Avesta, the cult of Mithra, though older than the Gathas, was for a time or in one region of Iran rejected or eclipsed, since in those rituals it does not appear. Zoroastrianism and Mithraism were certainly not originally one, neither did one grow out of the other. 1415. And here arises the question whether Zarathustra, Zoroaster, so closely associated with the Mithra cult in the later portions of the Avesta, was a mythical figure or a real reformer who put a more spiritual or philosophic teaching in place of the simpler naturalism of the Vedic period. Mr. L. H. Mills, the learned translator and commentator of the Gathas, affirms in his introduction the historic reality 1416 and religious originality of Zarathustra, mainly on the ground that whereas in the later Avesta he is lost in myth, in the Gathas he figures quite simply as a real person. 1417. From the conclusion thus drawn, some of us must respectfully but firmly dissent. The Gathas, critically considered, do not warrant it. On the contrary, the ostensibly earliest so clearly present Zarathustra as either an ideal or an official figure that Mr. Mills is driven to try to explain them by the question, can there have been a school, or family, of Zarathustrians, religious poets, similar to the Vedic seers? 1418. Equally vital is his suggestion that, the special eminence of the governor of Raga as needing no Zarathustra over him, that is, no imperial chief, Yasna 19:19, may be attributed to the successors of Zarathustra. 1419. The fact is that the Gathas imply rather an established sacerdotal or quasi-regal functionary than a single notable man when they speak of Zarathustra Spitama. 1420. Still more unconvincing is the claim made for Zoroastrian doctrine as something primarily abnormal. Mr. Mills first claims that, nowhere at their period had there been a human voice, so far as we have any evidence, which uttered thoughts like these, but immediately afterwards, doubtless realizing the impossibility of founding a cult all of a sudden with entirely new ideas, he admits that Zarathustra was probably only the last visible link in a far extended chain. His system, like those of his predecessors and successors, was a growth. His main conceptions had been surmised, although not spoken before. 1421. The last clause returns to the arbitrary. There is positively no ground for seeing in the Gathas new ideas by a new man, they have all the air of a gradually evolved ritual. The abnormal depth which Mr. Mills ascribes to them, finally, appears to be illusory. He affirms 1422 that, the mental heaven and hell with which we are now familiar as the only future states recognized by intelligent people, and thoughts which, in spite of their familiarity, can never lose their importance, are not only used and expressed in the Gathas, but expressed there, so far as we are aware, for the first time. But this claim proceeds on such expressions as, for the wicked the worst life, for the holy the best mental state, 1423, and to read in such expressions a negation of places of happiness and of torment is to misread alike the psychology and the language of primitive life. The modern who negates a physical heaven and hell, but still affirms a future state of mind, either evades entirely the fatal problem as to the details of that state or verbally affirms its non-locality. There is no reason whatever to suppose that in ancient Asia men either demurred to the doctrine of places of happiness 1424 and torment, or sought thus intelligibly to modify them. Worst life, and best state of mind, could perfectly well connote for early thinkers bodily states and local habitations. We must refuse, then, to let the sympathetic illusions even of scholars force upon us an otherwise unsupported belief in the occurrence of a remarkable personality which of its own sheer moral power wrought a sudden and signal innovation in that most conservative of processes, ancient sacerdotal religion. The religious dualism ascribed to Zarathustra is in all likelihood a natural adaptation by priests of a polytheistic process of thought, 1425, and it seems far more likely that Zarathustra is an ancient title for a kind of priest-king 1426, since both functions appear to go with the name in the early Gathas, than that there was a man so named who invented monotheistic dualism, 1427, even as Abraham is fabled to have discovered monotheism, and somehow succeeded in imposing his doctrine as a system of ritual and worship on his contemporaries. As Mr. Mills and Haug admit, there is not a single biographical detail on Zarathustra to be found. 4. Evolution of Mithra. Putting aside as otherwise insoluble the problem of Zoroastrianism, and recognizing that that system and the special cult of Mithra were originally separate but probably fused by some conquest. 1428 We proceed to note that the Mithra cult, both in this connection and later, underwent an evolution in which the god status slowly fluctuated, or was readjusted, like that of so many other ancient deities. For a time, and this suggests a Zoroastrian influence, he was graded as the subordinate of Ahura Mazda, Ormuzd. In the Indo-Iranian religion, M. Dharmastita writes 1429, the Ahura of heaven was often invoked in company with Mithra, the god of the heavenly light, and he let him share with himself the universal sovereignty. In the Veda they are invoked as a pair, Mitra Varuna, which enjoys the same powers and rights as Varuna alone, as there is nothing more in Mari, Varuna than in Varuna alone, Mitra being the light of heaven, that is, the light of Varuna. But Ahura Mazda could no longer bear an equal, and Mithra, in the Avesta, became one of his creatures. This Mithra, the lord of wide pastures, I have created as worthy of sacrifice, as worthy of glorification, as I, Ahura Mazda, am myself. 1430 But old formulae, no longer understood, in which Mithra and Ahura, or rather Mithra Ahura, are invoked in an indivisible unity, dimly remind one that the Creator was formerly a brother to his creature. He preserved, however, a high situation, both in the concrete and in the abstract mythology. As the god of the heavenly light, the lord of vast luminous space, of the wide pastures above, he became later the god of the sun, Deo Invicto Soli Mithri, in Persian Mir is the sun. As light and truth were one and the same thing, viewed with the eyes of the body and of the mind, he becomes the god of truth and faith. He punishes the Mithra drug, him who lies to Mithra, or who lies to the contract, since Mithra as a neuter noun means friendship, agreement, contract. Of 1431, he is a judge in hell, in company with Rashnu, the true one, the god of truth, a mere offshoot of Mithra in his moral character. 1432 The ritual of the Avesta is clear on the subject. We sacrifice unto Mithra and Ahura, the two great, imperishable, holy gods, and unto the stars, and the moon, and the sun, with the trees that yield up Beresma, burned on the altar. We sacrifice unto Mithra, the lord of all countries, whom Ahura Mazda made the most glorious of all the gods in the world unseen. So may Mithra and Ahura, the two great gods, come to us for help. We sacrifice unto the bright, undying, shining, swift-horsed sun. 1433 And in the teaching associated with Zoroaster we find Mithra extolled by Ahura Mazda as a beneficent and comforting spirit. Happy that man, I think, said Ahura Mazda, O spit Amma Zarathustra, for whom a holy priest, who is the word incarnate, offers up a sacrifice unto Mithra. Straight to that man, I think, will Mithra come, to visit his dwelling. When Mithra's boons will come to him, as he follows God's teaching, and thinks according to God's teaching. 1434 This, though still ancient, was doubtless a relatively late and high form of the cultus in Persia, since in the Avesta we find Mithra repeatedly invoked as a warlike and formidable deity, a god of battles, swift to assail and slay the enemies of truth and justice, which would normally mean, the enemies of his worshippers. But the evolution of a moral cult on such a basis was in the due course of religious adaptation, since in the Mahabharata Agni combines the same set of characteristics, being at once friendly to warriors and typified by a dove, while as the mouth of the gods he fulfills the highest moral functions. 1435 Thus, then, we have the cultus of Mithra as the sun god, the deity of light and truth, created by, and yet co-equal with, the supreme deity. 1436 And fighting on the side of the good against the evil power Angraminu, Ahriman, this at a period long before the Christian era. So much is certain, whatever we may decide as to the actual period of the writing of the Avesta, as it has come down to us. Of the literature of Mazdaism, of course, a great deal has perished, disappearing, says M. Dharmastita, not only from internal evidence, but from history. The Arab conquest proved fatal to the religious literature of the Sasanian ages, a great part of which was either destroyed by the fanaticism of the conquerors and the new converts, or lost during the long exodus of the Parsis. The cause that preserved the Avesta is obvious. Taken as a whole, it does not profess to be a religious encyclopedia, but only a liturgical collection, and it bears more likeness to a prayer book than to the Bible. 1437 We can therefore only infer the nature of the rest of the system. But we do know that, as time went on, the cultus of Mithra became more and more considerable. It is hardly accurate to say, as does Canon Rawlinson, that Mithra was originally not held in very high esteem, but it is the historic fact that he ultimately came to occupy a place only a little inferior to that assigned, from the first, to the Ahura Mazda. Darius, the son of Hystaspes, placed the emblems of Ahura Mazda and of Mithra in equally conspicuous positions on the sculptured tablet above his tomb, b.c. 485, and his example was followed by all the later monarchs of his race whose sepulchres are still in existence. Artaxerxes Mnemosyne, d.b.c. 358, placed an image of Mithra in the temple attached to the royal palace of Susa. He also in his inscriptions unites Mithra with Ahura Mazda, and prays for their conjoint protection. Artaxerxes Ochus, d.b.c. 337, does the same a little later, and the practice is also observed in portions of the Zendavesta composed about this period. 1438 Artaxerxes Mnemosyne, too, swore by the light of Mithras, as our William the Conqueror swore by the splendor of God. 1439 and in general the importance and range of the Mithraic worship at an early period may be clearly inferred from the mere vogue of the name Mithridates, the justice of Mithra, which we find in use at least 600 years before the Christian era. 1440 It is after the Persian conquest of Babylon, 538 B.C. that Mithraism begins to take the shape it wears in the period of the Roman Empire. Though historical details are lacking, we are broadly entitled to say that the Mazdaism of the Persians, in uniting with the astrolatory of the Chaldeans, produced Mithraism. 1441 It was presumably before this development that Mazdaism entered Armenia under the earlier Achaemenidi, 1442 who conquered that region about 625 B.C., for whereas Ahura Mazda, the supreme god, was in some measure superseded by Mithra in the later Mithraic cult, 1443 in virtue of the same psychological tendency that later gave to the Christian Jesus a nominal equality with and a practical precedence over Yahweh, we find the older Mazdean deity adored as the thundering god in eastern Iberia. As late as the 4th century. 1444 But Mithraism in turn was prepared in Armenia for its cosmopolitan career in the Western world, since it was from Armenian Mazdaism that it borrowed its enigmatic, supreme god, Chronos Zervan, the time spirit, a Babylonian conception, represented in the mysteries by the lion-headed or demon-headed and serpent-encircled figure which bears the two keys. 1445 And this deity in turn tells of Babylonian influence, since the conception of the two locked doors of exit and entrance in the firmament is of Babylonian origin. 1446 We must not exclude, however, the possibility that certain features of the Mithraic cult derive equally with those of some Babylonian cults from a common source of great antiquity. Mithra partly equates with Bel or Enlil, who seems to have been originally a war god of mighty weapons, and was known as Lord of Lands, 1447 even as Mithra is Lord of wide pastures, and all countries, and a bearer of glorious weapons, yet these seem to be early and not late attributes of Mithra. Bel, again, gives place to Merodach, Marduk, who assumes his titles and who becomes the mediator god, 1448 But this evolution in Mithra's case may follow older lines, even as his bracketing with Ahura Mazda, as Bel was bracketed with Anu, 1449 appears to be early and not late. New Year's Day is the festival alike of Bel, Merodach, and Mithra. This is an ancient idea. 1450 Yet again, when we find the Babylonian sun god and war god Shamash, the prototype of the Hebrew judge, Samson, figuring especially as the judge and the savior of men, the destroyer of the wicked and of the enemies of his worshippers, 1451 We need not suppose that Mithra, who has all these attributes, is primarily modeled on Shamash, though he was identified with him. 1452 The underlying concept is prior to both cults. On the other hand, when Mithra absorbs in himself the idea of the Logos, who for the Babylonians is a separate god, Nabu, the rival of Merodach 1453, as the Logos Hermes for the Greeks is the rival of Apollo, but later bracketed with him as his son 1454, we may reasonably suppose that the Mithraic adaptation is late. Of the deity thus shaped through many centuries, by many forces, it seems warrantable to say that his cult was normally in an ethically advanced stage, relatively to contemporary worships. In remote times, doubtless, he was worshipped with human sacrifices, like most other gods. The Persian practice of sacrificing on a high place, 1455 tells of early connection with the Asiatic cult of pyramid altar temples, which spread to Polynesia, North America, Syria, and Greece, always in connection with sacrifices of men and children. Of such sacrifice there is no trustworthy trace in the historic period, however, and at no time do we find any trace in his legend of sexual complications. Unlike Agni, unlike Krishna, and Apollo and Adonis and Heracles and Dionysos and Attis, he has no amours, and his conjunction with Anatis or Anahid, as we shall see, seems to have been rather a mystical blending of sexes than a conjugal union. His mate appears to have been primarily Ardavisura, a goddess of a sacred well, and of the earth waters generally, later blended with the Semitic Anahid, a goddess of fruitfulness. 1456 At times he may have been licentiously worshipped, 1457 as Anatis was, 1458 but in the Avesta and in the developed cultus so far as we know it he is always shown as making for righteousness. 1459 Theologically, he exists both in abstract and in symbol. Originally, he is simply the animized sun. Later, according to the universal law of religious evolution, he becomes a spirit apart from the sun but symbolized by it, the sun being worshipped in his name, and he being the god who sustains it, nay, an actual subordinate sun god takes his place, even in the Rig Veda. 1460 But since in Persian, as we have seen, his name, Mir, actually means the sun, 1461 he can never be dissociated from it, and as the same word also means, the friend, the light being the friend of man, 1462 and seems to connote love or amity, 1463 a moral distinction inevitably attaches to him in a stage of thought in which words have an incalculable significance. He is not a mere benefactor to be flattered. As the sun in nature can both succor and slay, as Apollo, called by Pindar 1464 the most friendly to men of all the gods, is also the destroyer, so the Persians sang, Thou, O Mithra, art both bad and good to nations, and to men, 1465 At length, the dualist theory holding its ground as a theological system, as it always will while men personify the energies of the universe, Mithra comes to occupy a singular position as between the two great powers of good and evil, Ormuzd and Ahriman, the Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu of Mazdaism, being actually named the mediator, 1466 and figuring to the devout eye as a humane and beneficent god, nearer to man 1467 than the great spirit of good, Savior, Redeemer, eternally young, Son of the Most High, 1468 and preserver of mankind from the evil one. In brief, he is a pagan Christ. Much has been written as to whether Mithra was worshipped as the sun, or as the creator and sustainer of the sun. There can be no reasonable doubt that the two ideas existed, and were often blended. 1469 We may depend upon it that for the weak and ignorant minds, which could conceive a personal god only under the form of a man or animal, or both combined, the perpetual pageant of the sun was a help and not a hindrance to elevation of thought. We can understand, too, how even to the thinkers, who sought to distinguish between matter and essence, and reckoned the sun only a part of the material universe, the great orb should yet be the very symbol of life and splendor and immortality, as well as the chosen seat of the deity who ruled mankind, and that it should be the viewless spirit of the sun who, in their thought, proclaimed to man the oracle of the soul of the universe, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, which is, and which was, and which is to come, the Almighty. 1470. 5. The process of syncretism in the great polytheistic era, however, the habit of personifying all the forces of nature led first to a universal recognition of the actual existence of the deities of foreign peoples, and later on to the idea that all the deities of the nations are but names of phases of one central and omnipotent power. Even among the philosophers and theologians, of course, this conception never really destroyed the habit of thinking of the alleged phases or manifestations of the deity as being really minor deities, 1471 and much more a matter of course was it that among the multitude the deity or deities should always be conceived in a quite concrete form. But the synthesizing tendency early resulted in this, that different cults were combined, different god names identified as pointing to the same god, and different gods combined into unities of 2, 3, 4, or more members. Egypt is the great theological factory for such combinations, but the law necessarily operated elsewhere. The conception of a divine trinity is of unknown antiquity. It flourished in Mesopotamia, in Hindostan, in the Platonic philosophy, in Egypt, long before Christianity. 1472 But the combining process, among other variations, had to take account of the worship of goddesses as well as of gods, and in regions where goddess worship was deeply rooted it was inevitable that there should occur combinations of sex. This actually took place in the worship of Mithra. From Herodotus, 1473 writing in the 5th century B.C., we learn that in some way the god Mithra was identified with a goddess. The whole passage, though familiar to students, is worth quoting here. The Persians, according to my own knowledge, observe the following customs. It is not their practice to erect statues, or temples, or altars, but they charge those with folly who do so, because, as I conjecture, they do not think the gods have human forms, as the Greeks do. They are accustomed to ascend the highest parts of the mountains, and offer sacrifice to Zeus, and they call the whole circle of the heavens by the name of Zeus. They sacrifice to the sun and moon, to the earth, fire, water, and the winds. To these alone they have sacrificed from the earliest times, but they have since learnt from the Arabians and Assyrians to sacrifice to Aphrodite, Urania, whom the Assyrians call Mylitta, the Arabians Alita, and the Persians Mitra. This is one of the seemingly improbable statements in Herodotus which research has partly confirmed. 1474 He is accused, indeed, of blundering 1475 in combining Mithra with Mylitta, it being shown from monuments that the goddess identified with Mithra was Anatis or Tanit. 1476 But that the Armenian Anatis and Mylitta were regarded as the same deity seems clear, 1477 and there are other clues. It has not been commonly observed that Strabo twice explicitly brackets Anatis with a Persian god Omanus as being worshipped at a common altar. He saw the statue of Omanus carried in procession. 1478 There is reason to suppose that Omanus, or the Persian form of the word, was a name of Mithra, and that it is an adaptation of Vohumeno, barman, equals good mind, a divine name with a very fluctuating connotation. In one passage of the Zendavesta, 1479 Vohumeno figures as the doorkeeper of heaven, but he was also first of the Amshaspentas or Amshaspans, of whom Mithra too, making 7, was chief, and he ranks further in the Avesta with Ahura Mazda as judge of the dead, and again as the firstborn son of Ahura Mazda, as was Mithra later. Yet again, he is identified with the creative power, 1480 and it seems impossible that the conception of the good mind should have been prevented from coalescing either with that of Ahura Mazda, who was not represented by a statue, or with that of Mithra, so making him the Word. In any case, the fact of the combination of Mithra in a double personality with that of a goddess is made clear, not only by the statement of the Christian controversialist Julius Firmicus, in the 4th century, and later writers, that the Persians make Mithras both two-sexed and threefold or three-formed, 1481, but by innumerable Mithraic monuments on which appear the symbols of two deities, male and female, the sun and the moon, or, it may be, male and female principles of the sun or of the earth. And this epicene or double-sexed character is singularly preserved to us in that Mithraic monument of the Greco-Roman period which we possess in our own British Museum, in which the divine slayer of the bull presents a face of perfect and sexless beauty, feminine in its delicate loveliness of feature, masculine in its association with the male form. In such a combination there is reason to see a direct influence of the old Akkado-Babylonian system on the later Mazdean. From the old Akkadians the Semites received the conception of a trinity, the divine father and mother by the side of their son the sun god, 1482, but their own ruling tendency was to give every god, up to the highest, colorless double or wife, 1483, and in the final blending of these in a double-sex deity we have the consummation of the idea. It was not special to Asia, for the Egyptians gave a double sex alike to moon, earth, air, fire, and water, making the earth male as rock, female as arable soil, fire masculine as heat, female as light, and so on, 1484, and the Greeks and Romans accepted the notion, 1485, but it was probably from Chaldea that it reached the Mithraists. Bel had been represented as both father and mother of Enlil, and Belti as both father and mother of Ninlil, and there are yet other instances of the Babylonian vogue of the idea of a god combining the two sexes. 1486 There is a further presumption that it was either from Babylonia or through Mithraism as modified after the Persian conquest of Babylon that the idea of a double-sex deity reached the Greeks. In the Orphic hymns, which probably represent the theosophy of several centuries before our era, it is predicated of 4 deities, of whom 2, the moon and nature, Selene and Physios, are normally female, and 2, Adonis and Dionysos, normally male. 1487 Selene is further identified with Men, the moon god, who, as being double-sexed like Mithra, was finally identified with him in worship and on coins. 1488 As Dionysos and Adonis, originally vegetation gods, have at this stage become identified with the sun, there arises a presumption that a solar cult has been imitated, though at the same time the solar cult may have adopted features from the others. The likelihood is that the notion of a double-sex deity was the outcome on the one hand of the concrete practice of bracketing a male and a female deity together, and on the other hand of speculation on the essence of divinity. But the concrete process probably came first, and the conjunction of the symbols or heads of a male and female deity in one monument or sculpture would give the lead to a mystical theory of a TWY-sexed being. 6. Symbols of Mithra. To point to these Mithraic monuments, of which there are so many examples, is to point out, further, that the old Persian aversion to images of deity had disappeared with the extension of the Mithraic cultus. 1489. There is no doubt as to the original forbiddal of images, despite the common delusion that the Jews were the first to lay down such a veto. But it was inevitable that, in the artistic countries, 1490 the adoption of Mithraism should involve the representing Mithra by images, like other deities. Nor was this all. One reason for regarding the Zendavesta as substantially ancient is the comparative simplicity of the Mithra cultus it sets forth. Just as happened with Christianity later, the spreading faith assimilated all manner of ancient symbolisms, and new complications of ritual, and Mithra is associated with the strange symbolic figures of the lion-headed serpentine god, bearing two keys, but above all is presented in that of the slayer of the bull. Whence came that conception? There are many explanations. It has been variously decided that the bull slain by Mithra is the symbol of the earth, the symbol of the moon, the symbol of the sun, the symbol of lust, the symbol of evil, the symbol of the cloud, the bull of the zodiac, and the cosmogonic bull of the Magian system. 1491. All of these conceptions may be held to connect with the symbolism of the Veda, where Agni is the bull, and it is in a similarly early sense, as the sun god among the cows, that Mithra is in the Avesta the bull and the cow stealer. 1492, which last name he retains in the late Roman period, 1493, when he has the epithet in common with Hermes. On the basis of the primitive nature myth arose a host of imageries, all interfluent and inseparable, because all fanciful. Anyone who has followed the maze of symbolism in Plutarch's Isis and Osiris will be prepared to believe that for the later ancients Mithra as the bull had half a dozen significations. 1494. In that famous treatise, Isis and Osiris and Typhon successively represent a number of different nature forces: sun, moon, moisture, the Nile, the earth, generative warmth, injurious heat, and so on, shifting and exchanging their places, till it becomes plain that the old theosophy was but a ceaseless flux of more or less congruous fancies. We may be sure that Mithraism was as hospitable to mystic meanings as Osirianism. It is intelligible and probable that Mithra slaying the bull should have meant for many the rays of the sun penetrating the earth, and so creating life for mundane creatures. 1495. As the dog feeds on the blood. 1496. Of the slain bull. In the Vendidad, the older, Vedic, god Yima, whose glory was secured by Mithra when Yima fell through disobedience, 1497, is represented as sealing the earth with his golden seal, and thrusting into it with his dagger, 1498, which is perhaps the earliest form of the myth under notice. But those who adopt this as the whole explanation, 1499, overlook a principle perhaps bound up with the origin of Mithraism proper, the significance of the bull as one of those signs of the zodiac through which the sun passed in his annual course. It is nearly certain that the zodiac was the source of very much of the later symbolism and mysticism of those ancient cults which their priesthoods associated with the sun, not to speak of those whose priesthoods professedly repudiated sun worship. And one of the most important facts established by the collection and comparison of ancient monuments 1500 is, that the Mithraic cultus connects symbolically with an Assyrian or Akkadian cultus far older, the cult which produced those common Assyrian monuments in which a divine or kingly personage slays a lion or a bull, thrusting a sword through him. 1501. There can be little doubt that these successive religious representations of the slaying of the lion and the slaying of the bull rest partly on a zodiacal system of sacred symbolism, in which the slaying of a given animal means either the passing of the sun into or out of a particular sign of the zodiac at a particular season of the year, or the slaying of the animal represented as a special sacrifice, or both. The zodiac, which is of immense antiquity, 1502, has come to be conventionalized, that is to say, it is fixed, so that the signs have long ceased to coincide with the actual constellations whose names they bear. But originally the students of the stars must needs have had regard to the actual constellations. And this carries us very far back indeed. The view that the slaying of the bull originally pointed to the sun's entering the sign of the bull at either the vernal equinox or the winter solstice 1503 is supported by the circumstance that the bull was at once a symbol of the sun god and a symbol of agriculture, the early plough being drawn by bulls or oxen, whence possibly the naming of the constellation 1504, and is strongly suggested further by the hostile function assigned in the monuments to the Scorpion, which is the opposing sign, and would represent the autumnal equinox. 1505. This symbol then dates back, probably, more than 3,000 years before the Christian era, 6,000 years if we assume the original zodiacal year to have begun at the winter solstice, while the symbol of the slaying of the lion would signify the sun's entrance into Leo at midsummer in the same periods, and may connect with the worship of Tammuz, after whom the midsummer month was named in Syria, unless the god took his name from the month. In point of fact, astronomy tells us that, by the precession of the equinoxes, the constellation of the Bull had ceased to be the sun's place at the vernal equinox for about 2,100 years before the reign of Augustus, the constellation of the Ram taking its place. Still, just as the symbol of the slaying of the lion had, on this theory, held its ground in religion after the bull played a similar part, so did the sign of the bull play its part in symbol and ceremony long after the sun had begun to enter the constellation Aries at the sacred season. Nevertheless, and this seems a crowning vindication of the zodiacal theory, while the bull holds its place on the monuments of the Christian era, we find at this very period, in connection with the worship of Mithra as with those of Dionysos 1506 and, more anciently, of Amun 1507, an actual ceremony of slaying a ram in honor of the sun god. In Persia, the sign Aries, the ram, was known as the lamb, 1508, and in some of the Mithraic mysteries at the Christian era, it was a lamb that was slain. 1509. That fact, as we shall see, has further bearings, but thus far it surely counts for much as a proof of the zodiacal element in the symbolism of the ancient sophisticated sun worships. The notion of a fish god is deeply rooted in several of the older Eastern religions, 1510, and though it may be explained as arising from the fancy that the sun was a fish, who plunged into the sea in the evening and emerged in the morning, a natural type of immortality for later mystics, it also strongly suggests an ancient connection with zodiacal astrology. In any case, there is no more plausible explanation than the zodiacal one of the early Christian habit of calling Jesus Christ the fish. The sign of the fishes comes next the ram in the zodiac, and that constellation had actually taken the place of the ram, at the spring equinox, when this symbol came into use. 1511. We may further infer, when we read of Phrixus, the son of Athamas, who was carried to Colchis by a ram with a golden fleece, 1512, and who in his statue on the Acropolis was represented as having just sacrificed the ram to some god, 1513, that in some Eastern cult 1514 which the Greeks misunderstood, a deity was latterly figured as born on the zodiacal ram, in the manner of Mithras, bull-born, 1515, and as sacrificing the ram in its turn. And that there was a constant astronomical significance in the Mithraic cult in particular, we know from the testimony of Origen, to the effect that its mysteries included an elaborate representation of the movements and relations of the stars and the planets, and the movements of the disembodied human soul among these. 1516. Every widespread religion, however, is necessarily a complex of many ideas, and in the cult of Mithra this is abundantly seen. In the course of its Western evolution it became closely associated, like that of Attis, with the popular worship of Cybele, the Magna Mater, mother of the gods, 1517, and in virtue of Roman military tradition it was bracketed with that of many specifically Roman deities. In the Mithraic cave temples have been found images and names of Juno, Minerva, Apollo, Mars, Bacchus, Mercury, and Venus, and especially Silvanus, who had taken on the character of a pantheistic god, doubtless because he was the Latin equivalent of the Greek Pan. This, by the way, is not the sole reason for approximating Mithra to Pan. 1518. A collocation of the sun god with the goat god occurs constantly in Greek mythology, and can be clearly traced back to the Babylonian system, on which Mithraism had independently drawn. 1519. The image of the slaying of the bull, in particular, whatever its original bearing, came to be associated specially with the idea of sacrifice and purification, and the great vogue of the Phrygian institutions of the Taurobolium and Cryobolium 1520, or purification by the blood of bulls and rams, must have reacted on Mithraism, even if it were not of strictly Mithraic origin. Mithra, like Osiris 1521 and Dionysos 1522 we saw, 1523 was the bull as well as the god to whom the bull was sacrificed, even as Amun, to whom rams were sacrificed, was the great ram, 1524, and herein lies one of the germs of the dogma of the death and resurrection of the god, another being the ancient astronomic myth, to which we shall come later, of the descent of the god to Hades. In the procedure of the taurobolia and cryobolia, which grew very popular in the Roman world, 1525, we have the literal and original meaning of the phrase, washed in the blood of the Lamb, the doctrine being that resurrection and eternal life were secured by drenching or sprinkling with the actual blood of a sacrificial bull or ram, often doubtless a lamb, that being a common sacrifice from time immemorial, on the ground that for certain purposes the victim must be sexually pure. Thus we have such mortuary inscriptions as Taurobolio cryobolio in aeternum renitus, by the bull sacrifice and the ram sacrifice born again for eternity, 1526. But inasmuch as there was a constant tendency in the mystical systems to substitute symbolism for concrete usages, the Mithraists may be surmised to have ultimately performed their sacrificial rites in a less crude form than that described by Prudentius. 1527. 7. The cultus resembling other cults at various points, the Mithraic was latterly peculiar in others. The great specialty of this worship, as we learn from several writers, is that it was carried on in caves, so far at least as its special mysteries were concerned, the cave being considered so all-important that, where natural caves did not exist, the devotees made artificial ones. 1528 Porphyry puts it on record 1529 that the Persians, mystically signifying the descent of the soul into the sublunary regions, and its regression thence, initiate the mystic in a place which they call a cavern. 4. As Eubulos says, Zoroaster was the first who consecrated in the neighboring mountains of Persia a cave, in which there were flowers and fountains, in honor of Mithra, the maker and father of all things, a cave, according to him, being an image of the world, which was made by Mithra. But the things contained in the cavern were symbols of the mundane elements and climates. This explanation of the cave was not improbably suggested by a well-known passage in Plato, 1530, and it is obvious that the custom must have had some simpler origin. At an early culture stage among the Romans, indeed, we find the name mundus given to the sacred cave on the Palatine Hill into which the people threw specimens of all their domestic utensils and a handful of Roman earth. 1531. This is remarkably close to the symbolic idea in Porphyry, but there must have been an earlier form still. 1532. A cave, in fact, seems to have been one of the earliest forms of temple. 1533. It is easy to understand how to half-civilized man caves would have 100 mysterious significances, as places for dwelling or meeting made by the deity himself, and fire or sun worshippers would have the special motive supplied by finding in caves the remains of the fires of earlier men, and by the not unnatural theory that the sun himself went into some cave when he went below the horizon at night. Indeed, Porphyry admits that caves in the most remote periods of antiquity were consecrated to the gods, before temples were. Thus the Curetes in Crete dedicated a cavern to Zeus, in Arcadia a cave was sacred to the moon, and to Lycian Pan, and in Naxos to Dionysos. 1534, but, he adds, wherever Mithra was known, they propitiated the god in a cavern. 1535. It appears that the greatest sanctity attached to caves in the living rock, and there are many remains of Mithraic altars cut in rocks. 1536. Nay more, the rock came to be specially associated with Mithra. 1537. Who was named Rockborn, and the phrase, God out of the rock, or Mithras out of the rock, became one of the commonest formulas of the cultus. 1538. In these rock caves, then, or in artificial caves, the priests of Mithra celebrated the habitual rites and special mysteries of their religion. The rising sun would be daily hailed with joy, 1539, as among the Jewish Essenes, and sun worshippers everywhere, and during the night, when the sun was hidden, special prayers would be offered up. The first day of the week, Sunday, was apparently from time immemorial consecrated to Mithra by Mithraists, and as the sun god was preeminently the Lord, Sunday was the Lord's Day, long before the Christian era. 1540. On that day there must have been special Mithraic worship. But we have some exact information as to the two chief Mithraic ceremonies or festivals, those of Christmas and Easter, the winter solstice and the vernal equinox, the birthday of the sun god and the period of his sacrifice and his triumph. 1541. That Christmas is a solar festival of unknown antiquity, which the early Christians appropriated to their Christ in total ignorance of the real time of his birth, is no longer denied by competent Christian scholars, when they happen to allude to the subject. That Easter is also a solar festival 1542 is perhaps not so freely recognized. But we know not only that Mithra and Osiris, and Horus, like so many other solar and vegetal deities, were especially adored at the vernal equinox 1543, but that in these worships there were special formulas representing, Apparently at this date, 1544, the symbolical death of the deity, the search for his body, and the finding of it. The Christian Firmicus wrathfully tells how the priests of Osiris, who have a representation of the god in the most secret part of their temples, mourn for a certain number of days, presumptively 40, 1545 equals Lent, while professedly searching for the scattered members of his mangled body, till at length they feign to have found it, when they finish their mourning and rejoice, saying, "We have found him, rejoice we." 1546. And we learn also from Tertullian that Osiris in the mysteries was buried and came to life again. 1547. Some such idea would seem to be implied in the ritual performed by the people of Patri at the annual festival of Dionysos, when the god, called Asimnetes, the judge, or the king, represented by his image in a chest, was carried outside of the temple in the night, to be hailed by the worshippers. Of the image in the chest, it was obscurely told that the sight of it had driven Eurypylus mad, a suggestion that it may have been dismembered. 1548. But as to Mithraism, the details, if only we can be sure of one identification, are still more precise. The worshippers, Firmicus tells us, 1549, lay a stone image by night on a bier and liturgically mourn for it, this image representing the dead god. This symbolical corpse is then placed in the tomb, and after a time is withdrawn, whereupon the worshippers rejoice, exhorting one another to be of good hope. Lights are brought in, and the priest anoints the throats of the devotees, murmuring slowly, "Be of good courage, ye have been instructed in the mysteries, and ye shall have salvation from your sorrows." As the stone image would be laid in a rock tomb, the god being preeminently from the rock, and worshipped in a cave, the parallel to a central episode in the Christian legend is sufficiently striking, and in view of the duplication of the motive on all hands, in the cults of Osiris, Attis, Adonis, Dionysos, it is impossible to doubt that we are dealing with a universal myth. To assign the origin of the rite to any known religion would be unwarrantable, nor is it even certain whether it was originally a part of a solar or of a vegetal cult, though there are grounds for ascribing it to the latter. In any case, it was adaptable to both. It is argued by Dr. Fraser, the chief exponent of the law of the subject, that the god who dies and rises again does so not as sun god but as vegetation god, and it may be granted that the vegetation principle is either primary or present in the cults of Attis, Adonis, Dionysos, and Osiris. But on the other hand, the preeminently solar Heracles dies on the funeral pyre, descends to Hades, and reascends to heaven, the obviously solar Samson of the Semitic myth, who also in its earlier form probably descended to the underworld. 1550 dies ostensibly in his solar capacity, with shorn hair. 1551 blinded, and placed between the pillars, equals Heracles' pillars, and must, as God, have risen again, and even the strictly solar Apollo, as is shown by K. O. Muller, 1552, made his descent to Hades, as did Orpheus, who is inferably a day god. Now, the descent into Hades was for mortals simply death, and since the god as such cannot cease to exist, he may as well be said to die in one way as in another. In all these cases the explanation is more or less clearly astronomical, and it is so in the case of the descent of Mithra to Hades, noticed later, though, as above remarked, the sacrificial principle, identifying the god with the sacrifice, would so complicate the doctrine as to make the solar cult approximate closely to that of the vegetation god. This, however, was only one of the Mithraic mysteries, presumably celebrated once a year. We have further records of another enacted at the initiation of every new devotee, and probably repeated in some form frequently. Justin Martyr 1553, after describing the institution of the Christian Lord's Supper, as narrated in the Gospels, goes on to say, which the wicked devils have imitated in the mysteries of Mithra, commanding the same thing to be done. 4. That bread and a cup of water 1554 are placed with certain incantations in the mystic rites of one who is being initiated, you either know or can learn. This is borne out by Tertullian, who intimates 1555 that, the devil, by the mysteries of his idols, imitates even the main parts of the divine mysteries. He also baptizes his worshippers in water, and makes them believe that this purifies them of their crimes. There Mithra sets his mark on the forehead of his soldiers, he celebrates the oblation of bread, he offers an image of the resurrection, and presents at once the crown and the sword, he limits his chief priest to a single marriage, he even has his virgins and his ascetics, continents. Again, 1556 the devil has gone about to apply to the worship of idols those very things in which consists the administration of Christ's sacraments. Reference is here made to a certain ceremony of initiation. It strongly suggests the mysteries which are practiced in our own time among savage tribes in many parts of the world. 1557 The complete initiation of a worshipper, we know, was an elaborate and even a painful process, involving many austerities, trial by water, trial by fire, by cold, by hunger, by thirst, by scourging, by branding or bleeding. 1558 And the mock menace of death. 1559 Of these austerities different but vague and scanty accounts are given. According to some accounts they lasted 15 days, according to others, for 48. 1561 Old writer 1561 alleges 80 different kinds of trials. It is more likely that they numbered 12, seeing that on the Mithraic monuments we find representations of 12 episodes, probably corresponding to the 12 labors in the stories of Heracles, Samson, and other sun heroes, but probably also connected with the trials of the initiated. 1562 More explicitly we know from Porphyry and from Jerome that the devotees were divided into a number of different degrees, symbolically marked by the names of birds and animals, and apparently by wearing, during some of the rites, the skins or heads of these animals. 1563 Porphyry 1564 mentions grades of lions, lionesses, and crows, and higher grades of eagles and hawks. Jerome 1565 speaks of crow, griffin, soldier, lion, Persian, or Perses, son, Bromios equals roarer, or the bull, and father. Out of the various notices, partly by hypothesis, Lajard has constructed a not quite trustworthy scheme. 1566 representing 12 Mithraic degrees, 3 terrestrial, the soldier, the lion. 1567 and the bull, 3 aerial, the vulture, the ostrich, and the raven, 3 igneous, the griffin, the horse, and the sun, and 3 divine, the grade of fathers, named eagle, sparrowhawk, and father of fathers. 1568 It makes a sufficiently grotesque list, in this or any other form, but it is the old story, all religions are absurd to those who do not believe them. 1569 And it is not well for those who keep a private conservatory, however small, to throw stones. The mark on the forehead of the initiate, finally, was in all likelihood the cross, the universal symbol of life and immortality, and in particular of the sun god. Presumably it was not the Gammadion or swastika, the most specific symbol of the sun, for that appears to have been notably absent from Persian art. 1570 That it was one of the normal forms of the Christian cross may be inferred from the mode of Tertullian's statement, and from the fact that the tau or cross was inferably a forehead mark in the Judaic cult set forth in the Book of Revelation. 1571 We know that the symbol entered into the fire worship of Persia by way of architecture. 1572 And it could not have been absent from the imagery of an Eastern sun god of the time. 8. The creed We have thus far briefly examined what may for the most part be termed the skeleton or dry bones of the Mithraic religion, so far as we can trace them, at the period when it seemed to be successfully competing with Christianity. What of the inner life, the spiritual message and attraction which there must have been to give the cult its hold over the Roman Empire? Here it is that our ignorance becomes most sharply felt. So far as Christian zeal could suppress all good report of Mithraism, this was done, when Christianity, I will not say overthrew, but absorbed the Mithraic movement. There were in antiquity, we know from Porphyry, 1573 several elaborate treatises setting forth the religion of Mithra, and every one of these has been destroyed by the care of the Church. 1574 They doubtless included much narrative as well as much didactic matter, the knowledge of which would color the whole religious consciousness of Mithra's worshippers. We shall see later that clues still exist, one of which has been overlooked in studies of Mithraism, to some of the myths of the cult, and we may safely decide in general that just as the Brahmanas prove the currency of myths concerning the Vedic gods which are not mentioned in the Vedic hymns, so there must have existed a Mithraic mythology which is not contained in the Zendavesta, that being, though not a simple collection of hymns, a compilation for purposes of worship. The reconstruction of that mythology, however, is now hopeless. Too little attention, perhaps, has been paid to Kreutzer's theory that the name Perseus equals Perses, the Persian, and that the Perseus myth is really an early adaptation of the Mithra myth. 1575 The story of Perseus certainly has an amount of action and color unusual in Greek myth, and no less suggestive of Oriental origin than is the legend of Heracles. But unless new evidence be forthcoming, such a hypothesis can at most stand for a possibility. And so with the didactic side of Mithraism, we must limit our inferences to our positive data. These include the evidence of the Vendidad ritual that there was associated with the cult a teaching of happy immortality for the righteous, very much on the lines of that of Christianity. An extract 1576 will make the point clear. 1577, 27, 89, Zarathustra asked, O Maker of the material world, thou Holy One, where are the rewards given? Where does the rewarding take place? Where is the recompense fulfilled? Whereto do men come to take the reward that, during their life in the material world, they have won for their souls? 28, 90, Ahura Mazda answered, when the man is dead, when his time is past, then the wicked, evil-doing devas cut off his eyesight. On the third night, when the dawn appears and brightens, when Mithra, the god with beautiful weapons, reaches the all-happy mountains, and the sun is rising, 29, 94, then the fiend, named Visaresha, Ospitama Zarathustra, carries off in bonds the souls of the wicked deva worshippers who live in sin. The soul enters the way made by time, and opened both to the wicked and to the righteous. At the end of the Kinvad bridge, the holy bridge made by the Mazda, they ask for their spirits and souls the reward for the worldly goods which they gave away here below. 30, 98, then comes the beautiful, well-shapen, strong and graceful maid, with the dogs at her sides, one who can discern, who has many children, happy and of high understanding. She makes the soul of the righteous one go up above the Harabarazite, above the Kinvad bridge, she places it in the presence of the heavenly gods themselves. 31, 102, uprises Vohumano from his golden seat. Vohumano exclaims, How hast thou come to us, thou Holy One, from that decaying world into this undecaying one? 32, 105, gladly pass the souls of the righteous to the golden seat of Ahura Mazda, to the golden seat of the Amisha Spentas, to the Garumanam, house of songs, the abode of Ahura Mazda, the abode of the Amisha Spentas, the abode of all the other holy beings. 33, 108, as to the godly man that has been cleansed, the wicked evil-doing devas tremble at the perfume of his soul after death, as doth a sheep on which a wolf is pouncing. 34, 110, the souls of the righteous are gathered together there, Nairyosanga is with them, a messenger of Ahura Mazda is Nairyosanga. It is noteworthy, further, that in some codices of the Avesta is found this formula, he has gained nothing who has not gained the soul, he shall gain nothing who shall not gain the soul. The meaning is, gain a place in paradise, 1578, and the passage looks very like an original form of a well-known Christian text. For the rest, the Zendavesta, like most other sacred books, insists on the normal morals strenuously enough. It has strange special teachings as to the sacrosanctity of the dog, and its veto alike on the burning and the burying of bodies. 1579 is peculiar to Mazdaism, but these beliefs do not seem to have affected later Mithraism, whereas probably its special stress on truthfulness, not paralleled in the Ten Commandments, was maintained. We cannot, indeed, tell how the Mithraic priests dealt with the special problems of the life of the Roman Empire, but we are entitled none the less to protest against the loose revival of unfounded and exploded charges against the cult. To this day we find Christian scholars either saying or hinting that Mithraism was signalized in the Roman period by human sacrifices. For this there is no justification. 1580 The ecclesiastical historian Socrates 1581 does indeed allege that about the year 360 a temple of Mithra at Alexandria, long empty and neglected, was granted by Constantius to the Christians, that they found in it an adytum of vast depth, containing the skulls of many persons, old and young, who had been sacrificed to Mithra, and that the Christians paraded them through the city, whereupon there was a riot, in which Bishop George and many others were slain. But this narrative is unsupported even in ecclesiastical history, and is full of incredibilities. The pagans, in general, are represented as taking arms to avenge an attack on the Mithraic sect, though the Mithraic temple is expressly declared to have been long deserted, and the Emperor Julian, a Mithraist, is represented as writing a letter denouncing the Alexandrians for their conduct. Yet he merely speaks of the killing of George, where Socrates alleges a wholesale massacre. The whole story savours of mere odium theologicum, and will not consist with any other accounts of Mithraic worship. We do know that during the whole of the first 3 or 4 centuries it was charged against the Christians, by Jews or pagans, that they were wont to sacrifice a child at their mysteries. 1582 That charge was doubtless false, but it was constantly made. On the other hand, the only kind of record founded on for the charge against Mithraism is one which rebuts it. St. Croix, accepting the plainly worthless testimony of the ecclesiastical historian, referred 1583 to a passage in the life of Commodus by Lampridius, in the Augustan history, in support of his insinuation that Mithraism involved human sacrifice. But this passage 1584 explicitly says that Commodus polluted the rites of Mithras by a real homicide, where it is usual for something to be said or done for the purpose of causing terror, quam illic aliquid ad speciem timoris vel disi vel fingi solit. The same scholar makes another reference which equally serves to confute him. 1585. Yet an English writer later speaks of the dark and fearful mysteries of Mithra, repeating the old insinuation. 1586. Selden 1587 quotes from Photius 1588 a statement that men, women, and boys were sacrificed to Mithra, but that assertion also is plainly valueless, coming as it does from a Christian writer of the 10th century, and being absolutely without ancient corroboration. What seems to have happened was a symbolical sacrifice, perhaps followed up by a symbolical eating of the god's image, proceedings which, there is good reason to suppose, occurred in the mysteries of the early Christians. 1589. But there is far more testimony, such as it is, for the charge of infamous procedure against the Christians than against the Mithraists. The Mithraic mysteries, save for the fact that they involved real austerities and a scenic representation of death, 1590 were no more dark and fearful than the Christian mysteries are known to have been, not to speak of what these are said to have been. There lies against them no such imputation of license as was constantly brought against the midnight meetings of the Christians, or as is specifically brought by Paul against his own converts at Corinth. Their purpose was unquestionably moral as well as consolatory. 1591. In the words of Suidas, the worshipper went through his trials in order that he should become holy and passionless. In the course of the initiation, as we know from the unwilling admiration of Tertullian 1592, the devotee, called the soldier of Mithra, was offered a crown, which it was his part to refuse, saying that Mithra was his crown. And everything points to the enunciation of a theory of expiation and purification from sin, in which Mithra figured as mediator and savior, actually undergoing a symbolic sacrifice, and certainly securing to his worshippers eternal life. 1593. As to the doctrine of immortality being pre-Christian, it is now quite unnecessary to speak, and the whole Mithraic symbolism implies such a teaching. On most of the bull monuments, it will be remembered, there stand beside Mithra two figures, one holding a raised and one a lowered torch. These signify primarily sunrise and sunset, or rising spring sun and sinking autumn sun, but, as Lessing 1594 long ago showed, they were also the ancient symbols for life and death, and would further signify the fall and return of the soul. 1595. Nor was this the only point at which Mithraism is known to have competed with Christianity in what pass for its highest attractions. The doctrine of the Logos, the incarnate word or reason, which Christianity absorbed through the Platonizing Jews of Alexandria, was present in Mithraism, and of prior derivation. That Mithra was connected with the word appears from the Avesta. 1596. In the Vendidad, further, 1597. Zarathustra is made to praise successively Mithra of the most glorious weapons, Sreosha, the Holy One, and the Holy Word, the most glorious, thus joining and in part identifying Mithra with the Word as well as joining him with the Holy Spirit. And Emanuel Deutsch 1598 was of opinion that the Metatron 1599 of the Talmud, whom he equates with the ideas of Plato, the Logos of Philo, the world of Azaluth, of the Kabbalists, the Sophia or power of the Gnostics and the Nous of Plotinus, 1600 was, most probably nothing but Mithra, 1601 as the Metatron is on the Jewish side identified with the angel, promised as leader and commander to the Hebrews in Palestine, 1602 and that angel is quasi-historically represented by Joshua equals Jesus, the chain of allusion from Mithra to the Christ is thus curiously complete. In respect of the concept of a Trinity, as we have already seen, the parallel continues. By the admission of a Catholic theologian, the gods Ahura Mazda, Sreosha, and Mithra constitute an ostensible trinity closely analogous to that of the later Christists, 1603 and yet again Mithra, himself approaching to supreme status, rides to battle with Sreosha at his right and Rashnu at his left hand, 1604 or else with Rashnu on his right, and Kista, the Holy One, female, white-clothed, on his left. 1605 There seems no good reason for supposing that the doctrines of the Logos and the Trinity reached the Persians through the Greeks, on the contrary, they probably acquired them from Babylonian sources, on which the Greeks also drew, and it was not improbably their version of the logos idea that gave the lead to the Philonic and Christian form, in which the word is explicitly the light of the world. 9. Mithraism and Christianity. Of course, we are told that the Mithraic rites and mysteries were borrowed and imitated from Christianity. 1606 English scholars of good standing are still found to say that the Mithraic and other mysteries furnish a strange and hardly accidental parody of the most sacred mysteries of Christianity. 1607 The refutation of this notion, as has been pointed out by M. Havitt, 1608 lies in the language of those Christian fathers who spoke of Mithraism. 3 of them, as we have seen, speak of the Mithraic resemblances to Christian rites as being the work of devils. Now, if the Mithraists had simply imitated the historic Christians, the obvious course for the latter would be simply to say so. But Justin Martyr expressly argues that the demons anticipated the Christian mysteries and prepared parodies of them beforehand. When I hear, he says, 1609, that Perseus was begotten of a virgin, I understand that the deceiving serpent counterfeited also this. Nobody now pretends that the Perseus myth, or the pagan virgin myth in general, is later than Christianity. Justin Martyr, indeed, is perhaps the most foolish of the Christian fathers, but what he says about the anticipatory action of the demon or demons plainly underlies the argumentation also of Tertullian and Julius Firmicus. 1610 When, again, Justin asserts 1611 that the Mithraists in their initiation imitate not only Daniel's utterance, that a stone without hands was cut out of a great mountain, but the whole of Isaiah's words, Isaiah 13-19. He merely helps us to realize how much older than Christianity is that particular element of Christian symbolism which connects alike Jesus and Peter with the mystic rock. That Mazdaism or Mithraism borrowed this symbol from Judaism, where it is either an excrescence or a totemistic survival, 1612 is as unlikely as it is likely that the Hebrews borrowed it from Babylonia or Persia. 1613 In Polynesian mythology, where, as also in the rites of human sacrifice, there are so many close coincidences with Asiatic ideas, it was told that the god Taroa embraced a rock, the imagined foundation of all things, which afterwards brought forth the earth and sea. 1614 Here again we are in touch with the Graceized but probably Semitic myth of the rock-born Agdestis, son of Jupiter. 1615 Even the remarkable parallel between the myth of Moses striking the rock for water and a scene on one of the Mithraic monuments suggests rather a common source for both myths than a Persian borrowing from the Bible. In the monument, Mithra shoots an arrow at a rock, and water gushes forth where the arrow strikes. As the story of the babe Moses is found long before in that of Sargon, 1616, so probably does the rock story come from Central Asia. 1617 The passage in Isaiah, which strongly suggests the Mithraic initiation, seems to have been tampered with by the Jewish scribes, and corruption is similarly suspected in the passage General Xlix, 24, where the shepherd, the stone of Israel, points to some credence latterly thrust out of Judaism. Above all, the so-called Song of Moses 1618, in which both Israel and his enemies figure as putting their faith in a divine rock, and the hostile rock is associated with a wine sacrament, points to the presence of such a god symbol in Hebrew religion long before our era. There is a clear Mazdean element, finally, in the allusion to the mystic stone in Zechariah 16:19, the 7 eyes being certainly connected with the 7 Ameshus Bentes, of whom Mithra on one view, and almost on another, was chief. 1620 And when we find in the epistles 1621 phrases as to Jesus being a living stone, and a spiritual rock, and read in the Gospels 1622 how Jesus said, Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, we turn from the latter utterance, so obviously unhistorical, back to the Mithraic rite, and see in the mystic rock of Mithra, the rock from which the god comes, be it the earth or the cloud, the probable source alike of the Roman legend and the doctrine of the Pseudo-Petrine and Pauline epistles. The Mithraic mysteries, then, of the burial and resurrection of the Lord, the Mediator and Saviour, burial in a rock tomb and resurrection from that tomb, the sacrament of bread and water, the marking on the forehead with a mystic mark, all these were in practice, like the Egyptian search for the lost corpse of Osiris, and the representation of his entombment and resurrection, before the publication of the Christian gospel of a Lord who was buried in a rock tomb, and rose from that tomb on the day of the sun, or of the Christian mystery of divine communion, with bread and water or bread and wine, which last were before employed also in the mysteries of Dionysos, sun god and wine god, doubtless as representing his body and blood. 1623 But even the Eucharist of bread and wine, as well as a bread and meat banquet, was inferably present in the Mithraic cultus. 1624 For the Zoroastrian Hom or Haumar, identical with the Vedic Soma, 1625 was a species of liquor, and figured largely in the old cult as in itself a sacred thing, and ultimately as a deity equals the moon equals a king. 1626 Indeed, this deification of a drink is held to be the true origin of the god Dionysos. 1627 Even as Agni is a deification of the sacrificial fire. And whereas the Mazdean law associated the Haumar tree with the tree of life in paradise, 1628, so do we find the Catholic theologians making that predication concerning the Christian Eucharist. 1629 The cup of Mithra had in itself a mystical significance. In the monument we see drinking from it the sacred serpent, the symbol of wisdom and healing. 1630 Again, as there is record of an actual eating of a lamb in early Christian mysteries, a detail still partly preserved in the Italian usage of blessing both a lamb and the baked figure of a lamb at the Easter season, but officially superseded by the wafer of the Mass, so in the old Persian cult the sacrificed flesh was mixed with bread and baked in a round cake called mayazd or mayazda, 1631, and sacramentally eaten by the worshippers. Nor was this all. Firmicus 1632 informs us that the devil, in order to leave nothing undone for the destruction of souls, had beforehand resorted to deceptive imitations of the cross of Christ. Not only did they in Phrygia fix the image of a young man to a tree 1633 in the worship of the mother of the gods, and in other cults imitate the crucifixion 1634 in similar ways, but in one mystery in particular the pagans were wont to consecrate a tree and, towards midnight, to slay a ram at the foot of it. This cult may or may not have been the Mithraic, 1635, but there is a strong presumption that Mithraism included such a rite. We have seen that a ram-lamb was sacrificed in the Mithraic mysteries, and not only are there sacred trees on all the typical Mithraic monuments, but the god himself is represented as either reborn of or placed within a tree, here directly assimilating to Osiris and Dionysos and Adonis, 1636, and pointing to the origins of the Christian Holy Cross myth. The Christian assimilation of Mithraism is, however, still more clearly seen in the familiar Christian symbol in which Christ is represented as a lamb or ram, carrying by one forefoot a cross. We know from Porphyry 1637 that in the Mysteries, a place near the equinoctial circle was assigned to Mithra as an appropriate seat, and on this account he bears the sword of the ram, Ares, which is a sign of Mars, Ars. 1638 The sword of the ram, we may take it, was simply figured as the cross, since a sword is a cross. 1639 Again, as we have seen, Porphyry explains 1640 that Mithra is the bull demiurgos and lord of generation. Here then would be, as we have already seen, a symbolical slaying, in which the deity is sacrificed by the deity, 1641, and we may fairly infer that the symbolic ram in turn would be sacrificed by the Mithraists on the same principle. Now, it appears to be, as we have said, the historic fact that among the early Christians a ram or lamb was sacrificed in the Paschal mystery. It is disputed between Greeks and Latins whether at one time the slain lamb was offered on the altar, together with the mystical body of Christ, but it is admitted by Catholic writers, and this, by the way, is the origin of a certain dispute about singing the Agnus Dei in church, that in the old Ordo Romanus a lamb was consecrated, slain, and eaten, on Easter Day, by way of a religious rite. 1642 Of this lamb, too, the blood was received in a cup. 1643 Everything thus goes to show not only that the lamb in the early Christian cultus was a god symbol from remote antiquity, but that it was regarded in exactly the same way as the symbolical lamb in the Mithraic cult. 1644 In the Apocalypse, one of the earliest quasi-Christian documents, and one that exhibits to us the stage in which Jesuism and the lamb god symbol were still held parts of Judaism, the Gentile differentiation being repudiated, we have the slain lamb god described as having 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God, sent forth unto all the earth, and as holding in his right hand 7 stars. 1645, that is to say, the 7 planetary Mazdean, Amshaspans, or Amisha Spenters, before mentioned, of which Mithra was the chief and as it were the embodiment. 10. Further Christian parallels. Still further does the parallel hold. It is well known that whereas in the Gospels Jesus is said to have been born in an inn stable, early Christian writers, as Justin Martyr 1646 and Origen 1647 explicitly say he was born in a cave. Now, in the Mithra myth, Mithra is both rock-born and born in a cave, and the monuments show the newborn babe adored by shepherds who offer firstfruits. 1648. And it is remarkable that whereas a cave long was, and I believe is, shown as the birthplace of Jesus at Bethlehem, St. Jerome actually complained 1649 that in his day the pagans celebrated the worship of Tammuz, equals Adonis, and presumably, therefore, the festival of the birth of the sun, Christmas Day, at that very cave. Given these identities, it was inevitable that, whether or not Mithra was originally, or in the older Mazdean creed, regarded as born of a virgin, he should in his Western cultures come to be so regarded. As we saw, there was a primary tendency, Aryan as well as Semitic, to make the young god the son of the supreme god, like Dionysos, like Apollo, like Heracles, and when Mithra became specially identified, like Dionysos, with the Phrygian god Sabazios, 1650, who was the child as it were of the great mother, 1651, he necessarily came to hold the same relation to the mother goddess. 1652, but in all likelihood there were ancient Persian forms of the conception to start from. It seems highly probable that the birth legend of the Persian Cyrus 1653 was akin to or connected with the myth of Mithra, 1654, Cyrus, Korsh, being a name of the sun, 1655, and the legend being obviously solar. Thus it would tend to be told of Mithra that he was born under difficulties, like the other sun gods, 1656, and his being cave-born would make it the more easy. It was further practically a matter of course that his mother should be styled virgin, the precedents being uniform. 1657, in Phrygia the god Agdestis or Agdistis, a variant of Attis, associated with Attis and Mithra in the worship of the Great Mother, is rock-born. 1658, like Mithra he is twy sexed, figuring in some versions as a female, and the coarse Greek story of the manner of his birth is evidently a myth framed to account for an epithet. Further, the goddess Anahita or Anatis, with whom Mithra was anciently paired, was preeminently a goddess of fruitfulness and nutriency, 1659, and as such would necessarily figure in her cultus as a mother, and as Mithra never appears, save in worshipful metaphor, as a father, he would perforce rank as her son. Precisely so does Attis in the Orphic Theosophy figure as the son of Athene, the virgin goddess, 1660, who in turn is possibly a variant of Anatis and Tanith, 1661. Finally, as the preeminent spirit Sreosha, equals Vohumeno, was connected with Mithra, 1662, so would there be a blending or assimilation of Mithra with Seotias or Seotiant, the savior and raiser of the dead, who in the Parsi mythology is to be virgin-born, his mother miraculously conceiving him from the seed of Zarathustra. 1663. As a result of all these myth motives, we find Mithra figuring in the Christian Empire in the 4th and 5th centuries, alongside of the Christ, as supernaturally born of a virgin mother, a mortal maiden or a mother goddess, and of the Most High God, 1664. And if the Christians made much of some occult thesis that Mithra was his own father, or otherwise the spouse of his mother, they were but keeping record of the fact that in this as in so many ancient cults, and more obscurely in their own, the god had been variously conceived as the son and as the lover of the mother goddess. 1665. In all probability they took from, or adopted in emulation of, Mithraism the immemorial ritual of the birth of the child god, for in the Mithraic monuments we have the figure of the tree overshadowing the newborn child, 1666, even as it does in the early Christian sculptures. 1667. So long as Mithraism was allowed to subsist, the competition continued. Even as Jesus in the historic creed makes the descent to Hades, like so many elder gods, so in the ancient Persian system Mithra was slain and passed to the underworld, this at the time of the autumnal equinox, when the sun enters Libra, the current month bearing Mithra's name, Mir. The evidence for the myth is peculiarly interesting, inasmuch as it is embodied in a tradition and a custom which have locally survived even the knowledge that there ever was such a deity. It is a Christian archaeologist who writes that Mirgan, or Mirjan, is the name of the 16th day of any month, and is the name of the 7th month of the solar year, and during its continuance the sun which enlightens the world is in the sign of Libra, which is the beginning of the autumnal season, and with the Persians ranks next in honor to the feast and holiday of the Nowruz, 1668. Here, too, the public day is at the beginning and the courtier's day at the end of a festival week. In the late legend, Mithra being lost sight of, the autumnal festival was explained by a story that, the Persians had a king of the name of Mir, who was a very great tyrant, and that in the middle of the month he arrived at the regions of torment, for which reason they gave the name of Mirgan, which signifies the death of a tyrannical king, for Mir has been allowed to mean to die, and Gan, a tyrannical king. 1669. The etymology is of course nonsense, mere being simply, as we have seen, the true Persian form of the god name Mithra, after whom was named the 7th month of the solar year. And the clear inference is that in the old myth the god went to the underworld at the proper solar date, the autumnal equinox, perhaps to rise again, fittingly, at the vernal equinox. Here we should have the proper pair of solar dates, which in the Christian cult are combined by making the god die and rise again at the spring equinox in the manner of Attis and Adonis and the other gods of vegetation, though on the other hand Jesus is tempted as the sun god by the goat god at the beginning of his career, sun in Capricorn, and rides on 2 asses like Dionysos at the beginning of his decline, sun in Cancer. 1670. In the Roman calendar we find still further traces of the old doubling in the setting of the Festival of the Transfiguration and the Festum Nominis Jesu on August 6th and 7th, and of the Assumption of Mary on August 15th, while the day of the Exaltatio Sacri Crucis is September 14th, and that of Saint Michael, the conqueror of the dragon of Hades, is September 29th. When we remember that the myth of the descent of Apollo to Hades was in time completely lost sight of by the Greeks, to the extent even of their forgetting that Admetus had been a name of Hades, 1671, we can readily understand the similar process in the case of Mithra. 1672. 11. The vogue of Mithraism. In view of this long series of signal parallels between the Mithraic and the Christian cults, it is difficult to doubt that one has imitated the other, and it may now be left to the candid reader to pass his own judgment on the theory that it was Mithraism which copied Christism. The Christian imitation took place, be it observed, because the features imitated were found by experience to be religiously attractive, Mithraism itself having, as we have seen, developed some of them on the lines of other Oriental cults. Its history, as far as we can trace it, is a series of adaptations to its environment. Mithraism in fact had spread in the West with just such rapidity as Christians have been wont to count miraculous in the case of their own creed. And we, looking back on Christian and other religious history with sociological eyes, can perfectly understand how such a cultus, with an elaborate ceremonial and an impressive initiation, with the attraction of august and solemn mysteries and the promise of immortal life, and with official encouragement as regarded the army, could spread throughout the Roman Empire in the age in which the primitive Roman religion crumbled away before the advance of far more highly specialized and complicated systems and a more philosophic thought. 1673. So special was the favor accorded to it in Rome that a Mithraeum was permitted to be dug in the Capitoline Hill under the Capitol, the most venerated spot in the city. 1674. Above all was it popular in the army, which, though the type of the social disease, really seems to have been to some extent a school, albeit a savage one, of moral strength and order at a time when an appalling abjection was overtaking the Roman world, men reverencing rank as dogs reverence men. One of the first stages in the initiation, for men, consisted in the devotees receiving a sword, and being called a soldier of Mithra. 1675. Hence the association of Mithra with Mars, and his virtual absorption of Janus, whose attributes he duplicated. Thus Mithraism was specially the faith of the soldiery, 1676, and in doing honor to the invincible sun god Mithra, Deo Soli Invicto Mithri, as the monuments have it, the Emperor Constantine vied with the most loyal Mithraists long after his so-called conversion to Christianity. 1677. The explanation of this phase seems to be that it was through Oriental militarism that the cult reached the West. We have it from Plutarch 1678 that Mithraism was first introduced to Rome through the Cilician pirates, whom Pompey put down, and it is known that those pirates were a confederation of soldiers and others formerly employed by Asian rulers, in particular by Mithridates, in whose army Mithraism would be the natural cult, and thrown on their own resources by the Roman conquest. 1679. As such piracy was not reckoned discreditable, and Pompey took many of the defeated pirates under his patronage. 1680. Their religion had a good start with the Roman army, in which so many of them entered, and which was for centuries afterwards so largely recruited from the East. It is very likely that the Roman authorities from the first encouraged the cult. 1681. As specially fitted for the soldiery. But the cult was not confined to them. Among the non-military congregations, we learn from the inscriptions, there were both slaves and freedmen, 1682, so that the cult was on that side as receptive as the Christian. But in one other respect it seems to have been less so. Among all the hundreds of recovered inscriptions there is no mention of a priestess or woman initiate, or even of a donatress, though there are dedications pro salute of women, and one inscription telling of a Mithraeum erected by the priest and his family. 1683 It would seem then that, despite the allusion of Tertullian to the virgins, 1684 of Mithra, women held no recognized place in the main body of the membership. 1685 It would seem, indeed, that inasmuch as the cult was conjoined in the West with that of the Great Mother, Cybele, as in the East with that of Anatis, women must have been thus associated with it, 1686 But if they were apart from the Mithraists proper, the latter would be to that extent socially disadvantaged in their competition with Christianity, however appropriate their worship may have been to the life of the army. Such an attitude of exclusiveness is probably to be set down in part to the spirit of asceticism which, on Tertullian's testimony, marked the Mithraic cultus as it did the Manichaeans 1687 and several of the Christian sects. Of none of the ancients can sexual asceticism be predicated more certainly than of Julian, the most distinguished Mithraist of all, and such facts dispose of the Christian attempt to charge upon the rival religion a cultus of sensuality. On a picture of the Banquet of the Seven Priests, in the Mithraic Catacomb 1688 there are found phrases of the eat and drink, for tomorrow we die, order, 1689 and these may stand for an antinomian tendency such as was early associated with Christism, 1690 though it is not at all unlikely that they were inscribed in a hostile spirit by the hands of Christian invaders of the Mithraic retreat. However that may be, there is absolutely no evidence that Mithraism ever developed such disorders as ultimately compelled the abolition of the love feast among the Christians. The Mithraic standards, in fact, seem to have been the higher, though both cults alike were sustained mainly by the common people, apart from the special military vogue of the older system. A Christian historian has even held it likely that, what won sympathy for the worship of Mithra in Rome was the fundamental ethical thought that the deity is set in constant strife with evil. The pure and chaste God of light, of whom no myth related anything but virtue and strife against evil, won many hearts from sin-stained Olympus above. All, the most ideal characters in the history of imperial Rome gave their protection to the Mithra worship, 1691 In all probability it was the poorer cult of the two, lacking as it did the benefactions of rich women. It has been inferred, from the special developments of Mithraism among the soldiers and the Syrian traders who followed the camp, that it was primarily, in the West, a religion of the humble, 1692 like Christianity, and that like Christianity it only slowly attained wealth. But inasmuch as it never imitated the propagandist and financial methods which the Church took over from the later Judaism of the dispersion, and always maintained a highly esoteric character, it escaped certain of the lowering forces of the Christist movement. One of these was the practice of systematic almsgiving, which attracted a motley mass of both sexes to the Christian churches. Mutual aid there probably was among the Mithraists, who in their capacity of organized groups or sodalitia were able to own their congregational property, 1693 but their different religious outlook and tradition excluded large financial developments. 12. Absorption in Christianity Now, however, arises the great question, how came such a cultus to die out of the Roman and Byzantine Empire after making its way so far and holding its ground so long? The answer to that question has never, I think, been fully given, and is for the most part utterly evaded, though part of it has been suggested often enough. The truth is, as aforesaid, that Mithraism was not overthrown, it was merely transformed. It had gone too far to be overthrown, the question was whether it should continue to rival Christianity or be absorbed by it. While Julian lived, Mithraism had every prospect of increased vogue and prestige, for the emperor expressly adopted it as his own cultus. To thee, he makes Hermes say to him, I have given to know Mithras, thy father. Be it thine to follow his precepts, so that he may be unto thee, all thy life long, an assured harbour and refuge, and, when thou must needs go hence, full of good hope, thou mayest take this God as a propitious guide. 1694 It is the very tone and spirit of the cult of the Christ, and as we have seen, the Christian fathers with almost one consent saw in Mithraism the great rival of their own worship. The spirit of exclusiveness which Christianity had inherited from Judaism, a spirit alien to the older paganism but essential to the building up of an organized and revenue-raising hierarchy in the later Roman Empire, made a struggle between the cults inevitable. The critical moment in the career alike of Mithraism and of Christianity was the death of Julian, who, though biased in favor of all the older gods, gave a special adherence to the war god Mithra. Had Julian triumphed in the East and reigned 30 years, matters might have gone a good deal differently with Christianity. His death, however, was peculiarly disastrous to Mithraism, for he fell at the hands of the Persian foe, the most formidable enemy of the later empire, and Mithra was, the Persian, par excellence, and the very god of the Persian host. There can be little doubt that Jovian's instant choice of Christianity as his state creed was in large measure due to this circumstance, and that at such a juncture the soldiery would be disposed to acquiesce, seeking a better omen. Yet, even apart from this, we are not entitled to suppose that Mithraism could ever have become the general faith, save by very systematic and prolonged action on the part of the state, to the end of assimilating its organization with that of the Church. Religions, we say, like organisms and opinions, struggle for survival, and the fittest survive. That is to say, those survive which are fittest for the environment, not fittest from the point of view of another and higher environment. What then was the religion best adapted to the populations of the decaying Roman Empire, in which ignorance and mean subjection were slowly corroding alike intelligence and character, leaving the civilized provinces unable to hold their ground against the barbarians? An unwarlike population, for one thing, wants a sympathetic and emotional religion, and here, though Mithraism had many attractions, Christianity had more, having sedulously copied every one of its rivals, and developed special features of its own. The beautiful and immortal youth of the older sun worships, Apollo, Mithras, Dionysos, was always soluble into a mysterious abstraction, and in the Christian legend the god was humanized in the most literal way, and for the multitude the concrete deity must needs replace the abstract. The Gospels gave a literal story. The divine man was a carpenter, and ate and drank with the poorest of the poor. So with the miracles. The priesthoods of the older religions often, if not always, explain to the initiated in the mysteries the mystical purport which was symbolized by the concrete myths, and in some early Christian writers, as notably Origen, we find a constant attempt so to explain away concrete miracle and other stories as allegories. But gradually the very idea of allegory died out of the Christian intelligence, and priests as well as people came to take everything literally and concretely, till miracles became everyday occurrences. This was the religion for the Dark Ages, for the new northern peoples which had not gone through the pagan evolution of cults and symbolisms and mysticisms, but whose own traditional faith was too vague and primitive to hold its ground against the elaborate Christian theology and ritual. We may say indeed that the preference for such a god as Jesus over such a one as Mithra was in full keeping with the evolution of aesthetic taste in the Christian period. Some may today even find it hard to conceive how the invincible God of the sun could ever call forth the love and devotion given to the suffering Christ. As we have seen, Mithra too was a suffering god, slain and rising again, victorious over death, so that to him went out in due season all the passion of the weeping worship of Adonis, but it is in his supernal and glorious aspect that the monuments persistently present him, and for the decaying ancient world it was still possible to take some joy in the vision of beauty and strength. Many there must still have been who wondered, not at the adoration given to the mystically figured Persian, beautiful as Apollo, triumphant as ours, but at the giving of any similar devotion to the gibbeted Jew, in whose legend figured tax-gatherers and lepers, epileptics and men blind from birth, domestic traitors and cowardly disciples. Ethical teaching there was in Mithraism, and for the Mithraists it would be none the less moving as coming from an eternal conqueror, the type of dominion. But even as the best Mithraic monuments themselves tell of the decline of the great art of Greece, so the art of Christism tells of a hastening dissolution in which aesthetic sense and craftsmanship alike sink to the levels of barbarism. In the spheres alike of Byzantium and of Papal Rome, the sculptured Mithra would yearly meet fewer eyes that looked lovingly on grace and delightedly on beauty, more and more eyes that recoiled pessimistically from comeliness and turned vacantly from allegorical or esoteric symbols. The more we study the survival of Christianity, the more clearly do we see that, in spite of the stress of ecclesiastical strife over metaphysical dogmas, the hold of the creed over the people was a matter of concrete and narrative appeal to everyday intelligence. Byzantines and barbarians alike were held by literalism, not by the unintelligible, for both alike the symbol had to become a fetish, and for the Dark Ages the symbol of the cross was much more plausibly appealing than that of the god slaying the zodiacal bull. Other substitutions followed the same law of psychological economy. Thus it was that Christianity turned the mystic rock, Petra, first into the Christ, 1695, but later into the chief disciple Petros, made an actual tunic of the mystic seamless robe of the Osirian and Mazdean mysteries, the symbol of light and sky, caused to be performed at a wedding feast, for the convenience of the harder drinkers among the guests. The Dionysiac miracle of turning water into wine made Jesus walk on the water not merely in poetry and symbol, as did Poseidon, but for the utilitarian purpose of trying Peter's faith and saving him, and put the scourge of Osiris in the Lord's hand for the castigation of those who defiled the temple by unspiritual traffic. 1696. There can be little question as to which plane of doctrine was the more popular. The Christian tales, in a different moral climate, represent exactly the commonplace impulse which built up the bulk of Greek mythology by way of narratives that reduced to an anecdotal basis mystic sculptures and mysterious rites. But that was not all. The fatal weakness of Mithraism, as pitted against Christianity, was that its very organization was esoteric. For, though an esoteric grade is a useful attraction, and was so employed by the Church, a wholly esoteric institution can never take hold of the ignorant masses. Mithraism was always a sort of Freemasonry, 1697 never a public organization. 1698 what the Christians did was to start, like Rome herself, from a republican basis, combining the life elements of the self-supporting religious associations of the Greeks with the connecting organization of the Jewish synagogues, 1699, and then to proceed to build up a great organization on the model of that of republican and imperial Rome. An organization so august for an era of twilight that the very tradition of it could serve the later world to live by for 1,000 years. The Christian Church renewed the spell of imperial Rome, and brought actual force to make good intellectual weakness. And so we read that the Mithraic worship was by Christian physical force suppressed in Rome and Alexandria, in the year 376 or 377, 1700 at a time when, as the inscriptions show, it was making much headway. 1701 at Rome. The deed was done by the order of the Christian prefect Gracchus, but the proceeding was specifically one of ecclesiastical malice, since even so pious an emperor as Gratian dared not yet decree a direct assault upon an esteemed pagan cult. But, once begun, the movement of destruction spread, and the Church, which still makes capital of the persecution it suffered at pagan hands, outwardly annihilated the rival it could not spiritually defeat. In an old Armenian history of the reign of Tiridates, 1702, it is told how St. Gregory destroyed in the town of Pakirage the temple of Mir, called the son of Aramazd, took its treasure, for the poor, and consecrated the ground to the Church. But such acts of piratical violence, which had been made easy by the earlier check to Mithraism in its special field, the army, only obscured the actual capitulation made by the Church to the Mithraic as to the other cults which it absorbed. Even the usages which it could not conveniently absorb, and therefore repudiated, prevailed within its own fold for centuries, so that in the 8th century we find church councils commanding proselytes no more to pay worship to fanes and rocks. 1703 and there were other survivals. 1704 but all that was a trifle as compared with the actual survival of Mithraic symbols and rites in the very worship of Christ. As to the sacrifice of the lamb we have seen, and though at the end of the 7th century a general council ventured to resist the general usage of picturing Christ as a lamb, 1705 the veto was useless, the symbol survived. Some Mithraic items went, but more remained. The Christian bishop went through a ceremony of espousing the Church, following the old mystery in which occurred the formula, "Hail to thee, new spouse, hail, new light." 1706 his mitre was called a crown, or tiara, which answered to the headdress of Mithra and the Mithraic priests. As to those of the priests of Egypt, he wore red military boots, now said to be emblematical of that spiritual warfare on which he had entered, in reality borrowed from the military worship of Mithra, perhaps as early as Jovian. And the higher mysteries of communion, divine sacrifice, and resurrection, as we have seen, were as much Mithraic as Christist, so that a Mithraist could turn to the Christian worship and find his main rites unimpaired, lightened only of the burden of initiative austerities, stripped of the old obscure mysticism, and with all things turned to the literal and the concrete, in sympathy with the waning of knowledge and philosophy throughout the world. The Mithraic Christians actually continued to celebrate Christmas Day as the birthday of the Sun, despite the censures of the Pope, 1707, and their Sunday had been adopted by the supplanting faith. When they listened to the Roman litany of the holy name of Jesus, they knew they were listening to the very epithets of the Sun God, God of the skies, purity of the eternal light, King of glory, Son of justice, strong God, Father of the ages to come, Angel of great counsel. In the epistles of Paul they found Christian didactics tuned to the very key of their mystical militarism. Their priests had been wont to say that, he of the cap, was himself a Christian. 1708 they knew that, the Good Shepherd, was a name of Apollo. 1709 that Mithra, like Hermes and Jesus, carried the lamb. 1710 on his shoulders, that both were mediators, both creators, both judges of the dead. Like some of their sacred caves, and so many pagan temples, the Christian churches looked toward the east. Their solar-lunar midnight worship was preserved in midnight services, which carried on the purpose of the midnight meetings of the early Christians, who had simply followed Essenian, Egyptian, Asiatic, and Mithraic usage, there being no basis for the orthodox notion that these secret meetings were due to fear of persecution. 1711 Their Mizd or Mizd, or sacred cake, was preserved in the Mass, which possibly copied the very name. 1712 Above all, their mystic rock, Petra, was presented to them in the concrete as the rock Peter, the foundation of the Church. It has been elsewhere shown 1713 that the myth of the traitorous Peter connects with those of Proteus and Janus as well as with that of Mithra, inasmuch as Janus also had 2 faces, led the 12 months as Mithra presided over the zodiacal signs and Peter over the 12 apostles, and, like Proteus and Peter and the time god in the Mithraic cult, bore the heavenly keys. Here again the mythic development of Peter probably follows on that of Jesus. At all events Jesus too has constructively several of the attributes of Proteus, as, I am the door, 1714, I stand at the door and knock, I am in the Father and the Father in me, equals Janus with the 2 faces, old and young, seated in the midst of the 12 altars, I have the keys of death and of Hades. The function of Janus as god of war is also associable with the dictum, I came not to bring peace, but a sword. Finally, the Epiphany is in January. But there is to be noted the further remarkable coincidence that in the Egyptian Book of the Dead 1715 Petra is the name of the divine doorkeeper of heaven, a circumstance which suggests an ancient connection between the Egyptian and Asiatic cults. On the other hand, the early Christian sculptures which represent the story of Jesus and Peter and the cock crowing suggest that it originated as an interpretation of some such sculpture, and the frequent presence of the cock, as a symbolic bird of the sun god, 1716 in Mithraic monuments, raises again a presumption of a Mithraic source. There is even some ground for the view that the legend of St. George is but an adaptation of that of Mithra, 1717, and it is not unlikely that St. Michael, who in the Christian East is the bearer of the heavenly keys, is in this aspect an adaptation from the Persian war god. 1718 The dragon slayer clearly derives from Babylon. From the Mithraists too, apparently, came the doctrine of purgatory, 1719 nowhere set forth in the New Testament save in the spurious epistle of Peter. 1720 And though their supreme symbol of Mithra slaying the bull was perforce set aside, being incapable of assimilation, they knew that the Virgin Mother was but a variant of the goddess mothers whose cults had at various times been combined with those of Mithra, and some of whose very statues served as Madonnas. 1721 Even as the doctrines of the Logos and the Holy Spirit and the Trinity were borrowed from their own and older Asiatic cults and those of Egypt alike. It has chanced, indeed, that those Christian sects which most fully adopted the theosophies of paganism have disappeared under the controlling power of the main organization, which, as we have said, held by a necessity of its existence to a concrete and literal system, and for the same reason to a rigidly fixed set of dogmas. We know that the Gnostics adopted Mithra, making his name into a mystic charm, from which, spelling it, they got the number 365, as from the mystic name Abraxas. 1722 Manichaeism, too, the greatest and most tenacious of all the Christian schisms, carried on its ascetic front the stamp of the Persian environment in which it arose, and visibly stands for a blending of the ascetic and mystic elements of Mithraism and Christianity. For the celebration of the slain Christ it practically substituted that of the slain Manes, at the Paschal season, reducing the crucifixion to a mere allegory of the cult of vegetation, and identifying the power and wisdom of the Saviour God with the sun and moon. 1723 Neither its adherents nor its opponents avowed that it was thus a fresh variant of Mithraism, but the Mithraists cannot have failed to see and signalize alike the heretical and the orthodox adaptation, and it is clear that Mithraism not only entered into Manichaeism but prepared the way for it in the West. 1724 The more reason why Mithras should be tabooed by the organized church. Thus, then, we can understand why the very name seemed at length to be blotted out. And yet, despite all forcible suppression, not only do the monuments of the faith endure to tell how for centuries it distanced its rival, not only do its rites and ceremonies survive as part of the very kernel of the Christian worship, but its record remains unknowingly graven in the legend on the dome of the great Christian temple of Rome, destined to teach to later times a lesson of human history, and of the unity of human religion, more enduring than the sectarian faith that is proclaimed within. 13. The point of junction. And still we have to note what appears to be the strangest concrete survival of all, cherished where we should least count on finding it. At Rome there is religiously preserved a chair which is alleged to be that of St. Peter. It is significant of the measure of knowledge and judgment with which the Church has been governed that this belief should subsist concerning a chair which ostensibly bears representations of the signs of the zodiac, and the 12 labors of the sun god. 1725 Peter, we are to suppose, having found his way to Rome, and established a Latin church with the facility which belonged to inspiration and the gift of tongues, proceeded to commission a sculptor, pagan or Christian, to carve him an episcopal chair, ornamented with the best-known symbols of the heathenism which Christians were supposed to be bent on overthrowing. Such a legend need not be discussed. 1726 We have already seen how at a variety of points the myth of Peter is a development of that of Jesus, and how, alike as leader of the 12, fisherman, rock, and bearer of the keys of heaven and hell, the first disciple assimilates with Mithra and Janus, who severally or jointly had those attributes, and whose joint cult acquired a special status in the Roman Empire as being at once that of the army and, on the side of Janus, that of the immemorial city. And whereas the legendary Peter thus closely conformed in symbol to the god out of the rock, the chief priest of the Mithraic cult at Rome compared no less closely with the Christian bishop, ultimately distinguished as Papa=Father. Among the grades of the Mithraists were that of the Patres Sacrorum, or Fathers of the Mysteries, and that of the Pater=Patrum, Father of the Fathers, whose seat was at Rome, and while there was a sacred Mithraic cave under the Capitol, we know from monumental remains that Mithraic worship was conducted on the Vatican Mount, where also was a temple of the mother goddess Cybele, and where also dwelt the Archigallus, or Arch-Eunuch, the head of the cult of Cybele and Attis. 1727 As the ruling tendency of the later paganism was to combine or syndicate all the leading cults, and as Roman patricians were then wont to hold at once the priesthoods of various gods, it is not surprising to find that in the year 376, under the emperors Valens and Valentinian, one Sextilius Agesilaus Edesius was Pater=Patrum Dei Solis Invicti Mithri, born again for eternity through the Taurobolium and the Cryobolium, and at the same time priest of Hecate and of Bacchus, as well as an adorer of the mother of the gods and Attis. 1728 On the Vatican Mount, then, if anywhere, would be the seat of the pagan pope who looked to the sun god as his savior, and worshipped the mother of the gods. It has been unsuspectingly asserted on the Christian side that the pagans raised their later shrines on the Vatican Mount by way of profaning the site of the grave of Saint Peter. We are now entitled to conclude that, on the contrary, the grave of Saint Peter was located by tradition on the Vatican Mount because that was the Roman site of the pagan cult to which the myth of Peter was specially assimilated. His grave was assigned where his legend was adumbrated, and, it may be, where his chair was found. For there is some reason to suppose that the chair of Saint Peter is simply the chair of the Pater=Patrum, the supreme pontiff of Mithra at Rome. In reality, the chair of Saint Peter is a somewhat nondescript object, of which the ornamentation does not fully exhibit either the 12 signs of the zodiac or the 12 labors of Heracles. It was exhibited to the public in 1867, photographed, and at that time examined by the eminent archaeologist de Rossi, who pronounced it to be in part of old oak much worn, containing a number of inlaid panels of carved ivory in the classic style, representing the labors of Hercules, the whole structure, however, having been renewed by supports and crosspieces of acacia wood, of which the ornamentation is medieval. 1729 In Rossi's opinion the older portions probably formed originally the curial chair of a senator, and it may be that the whole thing is thus a fortuitous importation, like so many other ecclesiastical relics. But there is an obvious possibility that it is a relic of a pre-Christian cult, and this is rather more likely than would be the sanctification of a mere senator's chair. The ivory panels, 18 in number, and not easy to decipher in a photograph, answer in part to the labors of Heracles. A few have simply the zodiacal signs from which the legend of the 12 labors was originally framed, some suggest rather the labors of Perseus, and some closely resemble episodes in the Mithraic monuments. It is not impossible, then, that the whole is an ancient artist's combination, for a syncretic cult of a number of the symbols of Oriental sun worship, to which all three legends belong. The myth of Perseus, perhaps equals the Persian, is at bottom identical with that of Heracles, and in Rome the Mithraists would be very ready to bracket the later conquering sun god with the older, the more so because their monuments presented scenes of the same order, and conjunction of cults was the fashion of the day. The old Roman Hercules, it will be remembered, was a quite different deity from the Grecian Heracles, who was a variant of the Semitic Melkarth and Samson, and though that Heracles was worshipped under the later pagan emperors by his Latin name, it does not appear that at Rome his cult was latterly flourishing. Tertullian indeed asserts that in his day there has been seen, Vidimus, a man burnt alive as Hercules, equals Heracles, 1730. But though this was a ritual sacrifice, its solitary celebration tells rather of a Roman show than of a cult. There were 2 shrines of Hercules Victor on the Capitoline Hill, and some 3 other Aedes in other districts, 1731. But the inscriptions of the period show no such interest in his cult as in those of Mithra and other Eastern deities. There was in fact no ritualistic worship of Hercules or Heracles at Rome, nothing to account for the use of such a chair, whereas the mysteries of Mithra were among the most elaborate then in existence, and the Mithraic priesthood one of the most august. Finally, we know from Porphyry, and from the monuments, 1732, that Mithra was habitually represented in the midst of the zodiacal circle, so that the pretended Petrine chair is in every way congruous with his worship. The fact that, in the Mithraic monuments, the zodiac begins with Aquarius, who in ancient art is represented somewhat as a fisherman, would of course appeal to the champions of Pt, whose ancient festival at Rome, January 18, coincided with the sun's entering Aquarius in the calendar, and it is the historic fact that the Mithraic order of the zodiac, beginning on the right with Aquarius and ending on the left with Capricorn, was imitated in Christian art. 1733. If, as we have surmised, an official substitution of Christism for Mithraism began under Jovian when the latter cult was discredited for Roman purposes by the defeat and death of Julian at the hands of the Persians, it is likely enough that an official change of the kind was effected at Rome, the Mithraic pater being either superseded or simply Christianized. In taking over the status of the Mithraic pontiff, the Christian Papa of Rome would acquire whatever remained of his influence in the army and in the civil service, besides completing the process of uniting in his own person the symbolisms in virtue of which he was head of the visible church. It was thus in many ways fitting that he should take to himself the actual chair of the Pater Patrum. However that may be, the historical and documentary facts enable us to infer broadly the line of adaptation of Mithraism to the Christian cult. It was presumably thus: 1. Before the Gospels were written, Jesus as Lamb was assimilated to Mithra in respect a. of his attributes of 7 spirits, and 7 stars, b. of his symbol of the rock, and e. of the mystic keys borne by the time god in his mysteries. In all 3 cases there seem to have been ancient Judaic myths to proceed upon. 2. The resurrection ritual, with its rock tomb, and the Eucharist of bread and wine, may have been equally ancient even in Jewry, but there is reason to suppose that both were consciously assimilated to the Mithraic mysteries. 3. As the Mithraic Pater Patrum assumed the symbols of the god, and the Christian bishop of Rome imitated the Pater Patrum, the tradition came to transfer from Jesus to Peter, the reputed founder of the Roman See, the attributes of the Persian god, and of those with whom he was identified in Rome. Thus, whereas Jesus had been key-bearer and rock before the Gospels were current, Peter finally was foisted on the Gospel in both capacities, while the more exclusively divine attribute of headship of the 7 spirits was practically dropped from Christian doctrine, and even the symbol of the Lamb was discountenanced. They had done their work, and were finally both incongruous and inconvenient. Part 4. The Religions of Ancient America. 1. American racial origins. In the study of the native religions of North and South America, there is a special attraction bound up with the special perplexity of the subject. These religions, like the peoples which have held them, seem to stand historically apart from the rest of humanity, unrelated, underived, independent. The first question that occurs to the ethnologist when he looks at the Native American races is, how and when did they get there? With which of the other human families are they most nearly connected? In the present state of knowledge, we still infer unity in the human race, and decline to believe that different human species were independently evolved from lower forms in different continents, acquiring the same physical structure under widely varying conditions. 1734. The suggestion to this effect by Waite 1735 represents the state of speculation before the bearings of the Darwinian theory had been realized. 1736. It is therefore fitting that ethnologists should try to trace a connection between the native races of America and the races of Asia, which are the nearest to them in geographical position. Until that hypothesis is either established or overthrown, our anthropology and our moral science must remain in large part unsettled. It has been argued that we may safely leave to ethnologists the task of deciding whether the whole human race descends from one original couple or from many, for, spiritually speaking, humanity in any case is one. It is one same spirit that animates it and is developed in it, and this, the incontestable unity of our race, is likewise the only unity we need care to insist on, 1737. But this defines rather the theological than the scientific attitude, for the very question whether an alleged spiritual unity is independent of a biological or genealogical unity is one of the preliminary problems of true, spiritual, science. As we go into detail, we shall see some remarkable coincidences between American and Asiatic and European and Polynesian religious systems, and our conception of human nature must alter a good deal according as we decide that certain peculiar superstitions and ritual practices were reached alike by various races who grew separately out of pre-human species, and these out of still lower species, in different parts of the world, without intermixture, or decide that the whole of the man-like family developed interconnectedly over one area, and that the different races now existing did not branch off from the central stem till they had already acquired what we call human characteristics, that is, until they had reached the stage of speech, weapons, and fire, at which they probably had religion. Suppose, for instance, that the American races came many thousands of years ago from Asia, and that they are kindred to the earlier Asiatic races. They would already have the germs of myths and a certain religious bias in common with peoples whose descendants subsist in Asia, and the coincidences in their religion would have to be pronounced historical, that is, they would represent a sequence of phenomena substantially determined by one original set of conditions within a given area and territory. If, on the other hand, we suppose that evolution proceeded in different parts of the planet and in widely different environments on identical lines from the lowest forms of life through many others, up to the anthropoid and the human, our whole conception of evolutionary law is affected, and that in turn must affect our philosophy. Looking inductively for evidence, we find what appear to be clear traces of the existence of man in the Mississippi Valley between 50 and 60,000 years ago, or perhaps even in the interglacial period. Without deciding as to times, it would seem certain that Paleolithic man, whether by way of Bering Strait or of Greenland and Labrador, peopled America from Asia or Western Europe, 1738, and there are some grounds for inferring two distinct racial movements. 1739. But to whatever conclusions the paleologists may come on that head, 1740, the original scientific and logical veto on the hypothesis of two or more independent evolutions of the human species must for the present hold good. However remote be the time of the first migration, then, we are shut up to the assumption that the American races derive from Asia, either directly or by way of Polynesia, 1741, since the alternative is a hypothesis of a human evolution from pre-human forms in the New World, with the result of yielding an identical human species, while the fauna and flora in general are markedly different. As to the possibility of such an evolution in America, Haeckel gives an emphatic negative. Putting the two hypotheses of immigration from Northeast Asia and from Polynesia, he adds, in any case the original inhabitants of America came from the Old World, and are certainly not, as some suppose, evolved from American apes. Catarrhine or small-nosed apes have at no period existed in America. 1742. The fact that men are so much alike in the two hemispheres, while the animals are so widely different, is a proof that the former are not autochthonous in America. 1743. Nor is there any physical difficulty over the hypothesis that the American races proceeded, by successive waves of emigration, from Asia. 1744. At Bering Strait, Asia and America are almost within sight of each other, and at one time they were united. And if we suppose a migration of tribes like the Kampskadals, who easily bear extreme cold, being but slightly civilized, we dispose of all such difficulties as the suggestion that pastoral Mongols would never have crossed without some of their animals. Prescott, however, remarks that it would be easy for the inhabitant of Eastern Tartary or Japan to steer his course from islet to islet, quite across to the American shore, without being on the ocean more than 2 days at a time, 1745, and this hypothesis is open. 1746. The question is one for the exact solution of which we have not sufficient materials, and it must be admitted that some ethnologists in the past came to their conclusions lightly. It has been said of Pickering, for instance, that he set up a connection between the Malay and the Californian because each had an open countenance, one wife, and no tomahawk. 1747. Happily we need not resort to such inductions as these. Nor need we be deterred from the scientific search by the fact that some of the guesses made have been wildly absurd. There is said to be widely current in Peru a legend, fully believed by the natives, that the name of the first Inca, Manco Capac, arose in the actual advent of a shipwrecked Englishman, who got to be known as Ingusman, and who married the daughter of one Cocapac, his son being accordingly called Ingus Manco Capac, whence the name and title Inca Manco Capac. 1748. That is droll enough, but we need not therefore proceed with Dr. Reville dogmatically to decide that everything shows that the civilizations of Mexico and Peru are autochthonous, springing from the soil itself. 1749. If it be meant merely that the higher forms of those civilizations, for there were many separate processes, may have subsisted for many centuries without foreign influence, there is no dispute, but the statement as it stands is an unwarranted assertion of a separate human evolution from pre-human forms. In the nature of the case, the primary separation of the American from the Asiatic races being admittedly very remote, there are not many close parallels to be expected. A number of extraordinary correspondences, however, have been traced, which point to migrations posterior to the Stone Ages. Take that, for instance, between the Aztec calendar signs and the Mongolian zodiac. The symbols in the Mongolian calendar are borrowed from animals. 4 of the 12 are the same as the Aztec. 3 others are as nearly the same as the different species of animals in the 2 hemispheres would allow. The remaining 5 refer to no creature then found in Anahuac. The resemblance went as far as it could. 1750. And no less remarkable is the analogy between the Mexican system of reckoning years by cycles and that still in use over a great part of Asia, seeing that this complex arrangement answers no useful purpose, inasmuch as mere counting by numbers, or by signs numbered in regular succession, would have been a far better arrangement. 1751. Such a correspondence must be allowed to count for much, and there is also a remarkable, though perhaps not a conclusive, resemblance between the Aztec, pre-Aztec, and Peruvian temple pyramids and those of Mesopotamia. 1752. Which derived from the earlier Akkadians or Sumerians. Ruins of these still subsist in Central America and Peru, which can be compared with the records of those of Babylonia and the one example at Saqqara in Egypt. 1753. Those temples or mountain houses doubtless began as graves, and grew into great mounds of earth, like those found in the Mississippi Valley. 1754. And the Asiatic, like the Mexican pyramid, was latterly one of several stages or terraces. 1755. 5 seems to have been long a common number in Asia, the Babylonian number 7 being reached only at a late period. 1756. And 5 was the number of stages or stories in the great temple of Huitzilopochtli, the Mexican national god. 1757. In the fact that such pyramid temples, or tombs of the same type, the former often carefully covered with masonry, and having likewise in some cases 5 stages, are found in many of the South Sea islands. 1758. We have a fresh reason for supposing an ancient distribution of races eastwards from Asia, in repeated waves of migration. 1759. So, too, we are entitled to surmise kinship, when we find that the Mexicans and some Native American tribes 1760 had a fixed usage of throwing the first morsels of their meals into the fire. 1761. That something like this is the practice of the islanders of Lamatrek in the Carolines. 1762. And those of Efate in the New Hebrides. 1763. And that many Tungusian, Mongolian, and Turkish tribes persistently do the same thing to this day. 1764. And it is difficult to believe that the peculiar usages of sacrificing a messenger, or ambassador, to the sun, painting him red, and hanging up his and other victims' skins, stuffed, as possessing a sacred efficacy. 1765. Were independently evolved in the 2 hemispheres. Even the practice of scalping seems to be peculiar to the Native Americans and the kindred Polynesians, and, in a modified form, 1766 to the Mongols, 1767 and, as we shall see, the Mexicans, like the ancient Semites and their Sumer-Akkadian teachers, passed their children, through the fire, to the fire god. What is more significant, they had the Semitic usage of making certain of their special sacrificial observances last for 5 days. 1768. There are remarkable concrete parallels, also, in the religious practices and symbolisms of Asia and Mexico, apart from those which may be taken as universal. Thus a stone or metal mirror was the symbol, and the source of the name, of the Mexican god Tezcatlipoca, and it is also the outstanding symbol in Japanese Shintoism. 1769. Recognizably a very primitive Asiatic cult. It is told, again, of the national god and war god Huitzilopochtli that, when the people came to Mexico from their home, his wooden image with certain war emblems was carried by 4 priests in an ark or chest, called the seat of God. Here we have a widespread usage, 1770, but it is significant that it is found in some closely similar form among Mongols, Chinese, and Japanese. So with the casting of children's horoscopes. 1771. More specific is the parallel between certain Mexican usages and those of the Buddhist priests of Tibet and Japan, such as red and yellow headdresses and black robes, 1772, which were in all likelihood pre-Buddhistic. Singularly suggestive of Buddhist contacts, however, are a number of Mexican sculptures. Many figures of Quetzalcoatl are practically identical with the established type of Buddha, and other carvings show hardly less close parallels. 1773. But no less significant of a general Asiatic connection, perhaps, is a circumstance which has not been much considered by the ethnologists, though it has been noted by the anthropologists, the fact, namely, that both in ancient Asia and in ancient America men kept records by means of knots in strings. 1774. The Chinese in old times are known to have done so, 1775, and it is told of Dravidian cons of Orissa that when brought to European knowledge 60 years ago they kept all accounts by knots on strings, and conceived of their gods as recording men's faults in the same fashion. 1776. This would seem to be exactly the method of mnemonics used by the Peruvians when they were discovered by the Spaniards, their quipus being described in the same terms, and there is evidence that the same device was used in Central America, and perhaps among the Tlaxcalans, though it had gone into disuse among the Mexicans, who had attained to the use of hieroglyphics. 1777. There remains the question of the source and nature of those hieroglyphics. To examine it in detail is beyond the scope of this survey, and it must suffice to say that as the Mexican hieroglyphic system proper represents an early stage in the evolution of writing from pictures to phonetic symbols, with a phonetic system developed alongside of it. 1778. The phenomena are quite consistent with the hypothesis of culture influences from Asia at a remote period. It is not necessary to identify glyphs in order to infer that the Chinese, Egyptian, and Aztec systems are akin. The Egyptian symbols remain substantially undeveloped for at least 2,000 years, 1779, and recent specialists are satisfied that many of the elements of hieroglyphic writing had been growing upon the banks of the Nile long before the time of the first historic dynasty, 1780. Given such a slow rate of growth, and noting the fact that Mexican and Egyptian hieroglyphics and Chinese script are all written in columns, we are provisionally entitled to see in all three the stages of a continuous evolution. 1781. It is true that the American languages, while demonstrably akin to each other, like the Indo-European group, show little or no relation to any of the languages of Asia. But though the difficulty of fully proving affinities of language between American and Asiatic races is great, and we seem thus bound to suppose a very remote separation indeed, on the other hand the extraordinary difference between the tongues of American Indians of the same race 1782 and the observed facts as to the rapid changes of language among South Sea Islanders, when isolated from each other, go to suggest that very wide deviation may occur in a few thousands of years among people of one stock who have separated at a stage in which they have no literature, and only the material beginnings of a ritual. Beyond this we need not go. It suffices that there is no conceptual obstacle to the assumption that the civilization of pre-Christian America grew from the Central Asiatic roots which fed the beginnings of civilization as we know it in Mediterranean Asia and Europe, and that from the practical certainty of an original migration of Asiatics to America there follows the probability that there occurred several, at different stages of Asiatic evolution. 1783. The hypothesis which seems best to meet all the facts is that America was first peopled from Asia at an extremely remote period, that there slowly grew up American races with a certain definite type of language, and that later immigrants from Asia or Polynesia, perhaps coming as conquerors in virtue of importing a higher civilization, were linguistically absorbed in the earlier mass, as conquering invaders have repeatedly been in the known history of Europe. 1784. 2. Aztecs and Peruvians. All this was recognized by the industrious Swiss historian of the American religions 50 years ago, 1785, when the real unity of the human race was still obscure, in that it was affirmed on such fantastic bases as the myth of an originally created pair and the counter-hypothesis of creation, in nations, either of monkeys or men, 1786, and when congenital theories of a peopling of America by the 10 lost tribes were much in vogue. There need then be no serious dispute over the thesis 1787 that the origin of the ancient American religions is to be sought for in the nature of their human spirit, a different thing from saying that they are autochthonous. The true proposition is neither that, as Muller says, the American peoples did not receive their religions from the peoples of the Old World, nor that they did. Both formulas are misleading. Inasmuch as their ancestors were distinctly human when they first passed from Asia to America, the germs of religion and of many rites were derivative, but like all other peoples they evolved in terms of universal law. And as their migrations are likely to have occurred in different epochs, and from different stocks, we may look to find in them, scattered as they are over an entire hemisphere, hardly less variations in language, aspects, and civilization than were to be traced in the races of the Old World a few thousand years ago. Such variation is actually seen when we seek to ascertain the connection of the different peoples of ancient America with each other. For among these there is fully as much variation as is found among the peoples of Europe. To go no farther, the Aztecs or Mexicans differ noticeably in certain physical characteristics from the Native Americans, and these again show considerable variations of type. A decisive theory of the culture histories of these peoples cannot yet be constructed, inasmuch as we are still very much in the dark as to the civilizations which existed in Central and South America before those of Mexico and Peru. For the title of this section, The Religions of Ancient America, is designed only to mark off the religions flourishing so lately as 400 years ago, and the aboriginal religions still existing, from that Christian religion which was introduced into Mexico and Peru by the Spaniards, and into North America by the English and French. The two religious systems we have chiefly to consider, the Mexican and Peruvian as they existed before the Spanish conquest, are not very ancient in their developed form, because even the two civilizations were comparatively modern. The Aztecs and the Peruvians, as regards their then situation, profess to date back only a few centuries from the conquest, and in both Peru and Mexico there were and still are the architectural remains of civilizations, some of which were themselves so ancient 1788 as to be unintelligible to the nations found by the Spaniards. Thus, near Lake Titicaca in Peru 1789 there are wonderful remains of structures which by their size suggested giant builders, the work of a race whom, or whose successors, the Incas overthrew, and yet further there are remains of rude circles of standing stones which belong to a primitive civilization far more ancient still. So, in Mexico, there are ancient ruins, such as those at Palenque, which suggest a civilization higher, on the side of art and architecture, and at the same time much older, than that of the Aztecs. 1790 All we can say with any safety is that, as it was put by Buckle, the earlier civilizations grew up in those regions where there were combined the conditions of a regular, easy, and abundant food supply, namely, heat and moisture, without an overwhelming proportion of the latter, such as occurs in Brazil. 1791 Now, from the point of view of the needs of an early civilization, the golden mean occurs, in South America, only in the territories which were covered by the empire of the Incas, and farther north, from the Isthmus of Panama to Mexico. We surmise then a long-continued movement of population southwards, one wave pushing on another before it, till some reached Patagonia. After a time, however, there might be refluxes. It is admitted that Mexican tradition points to early developments of civilization about the Isthmus and Central America, and then waves of migration and conquest northwards. And it may have been that the people called the Toltecs, who flourished in Mexico before the Aztecs, and were in several respects more highly civilized than they, 1792 represented yet again a backflow of one of these peoples from the north, according to the tradition. 1793 Their alleged silent disappearance, after 4 centuries of national life, is the standing puzzle of Mexican history. 1794 All that we know is, that Mexico remained the seat of the most flourishing empires, mainly because it could best yield an abundant and regular supply of vegetable food, as maize, and that when Cortés invaded it, the civilization of the Aztecs, who constituted the most powerful of the several Mexican states then existing, was among the most remarkable. 1795 And herein lies the instructiveness of these civilizations, with their religions, that they supply us with a set of results practically independent of all the known history of Europe and Asia. It has been remarked that the great drawback of most of the moral or human sciences is that they do not admit of experiments as do the physical sciences. You must take the phenomena you get and try to account for them, with no aid from planned repetitions of cases. But, on the other hand, the human sciences as latterly organized have an enormous wealth of data lying ready to hand, and some collocations of data have for us the effect of new revelations in human affairs. After men became absorbed in the conception of European civilization, with its beginnings, on the one hand in Aryan barbarism, on the other in the Eastern and Egypto-Semitic culture, they seemed to be shut up to a certain body of conclusions about human nature and its tendencies of thought and action. What was worse, the conclusions were presented ready-made in terms of the reigning religion. But when we go to the records of the cultures and creeds of Mexico and Peru, records wonderfully preserved in the teeth of the fanaticism which would have destroyed them all if it could, we stand clear of the prejudices alike of Jew and Christian. We are in a measure spared the old contrast between pretended monotheism and polytheism, the eternal suggestion of the possible diffusion of revealed truth. 1796 The perpetual comparison between Christendom and paganism. We are faced by a civilization and a religion that reached wealth and complexity by normal evolution from the stages of early savagery and barbarism without ever coming in contact with those of Europe till the moment of collision and destruction. And to study these American civilizations aright is to learn with clearness lessons in sociology, or human science in general, which otherwise could have been acquired only imperfectly and with hesitation. The culture histories of the two hemispheres, put side by side, illuminate each other as do the facts of comparative anatomy. 3. Primitive religion and human sacrifice. Whatever may have been the variety of the stocks that immigrated from Asia, it holds good that we may look in the less advanced American races for traces of the steps in the religious and social evolution of Mexico and Peru. The non-Aztec peoples of Central America, to begin with, had developed religious systems which in their main features recall the goddess worships of Semitic and Hellenistic antiquity, the most marked difference, as regards the historic period of the latter, being the American proclivity to human sacrifice. The summary given of some of them by Mr. H. Bancroft will serve to illustrate the old process by which the human mind reached the same essential results out of a superficial variety of materials. The most prominent personage in the Ismayan pantheon was Dababa, a goddess who controlled the thunder and lightning, and with their aid devastated the lands of those who displeased her. In South America, thunder and lightning were held to be the instruments used by the sun to inflict punishment upon its enemies, which makes it probable that Dababa was a transformed sun goddess. Pilgrims resorted from afar to her temple at Uraba, bringing costly presents and human victims, who were first killed and then burned. 1797 That the savory odors of roasting flesh might be grateful in the nostrils of the goddess. Some describe her as a native princess, whose reign was marked by great wisdom and many miracles, and who was apotheosized after death. She was also honored as the mother of the Creator, the maker of the sun, the moon, and all invisible things, and the sender of blessings, who seems to have acted as mediator between the people and his mother, for their prayers for rain were addressed to him, although she is described as controlling the showers, and once, when her worship was neglected, she inflicted a severe drought upon the country. When the needs of the people were very urgent, the chiefs and priests remained in the temple, fasting and praying with uplifted hands. The people meanwhile observed a 4 days fast, lacerating their bodies and washing their faces, which were at other times covered with paint. So strict was this fast, that no meat or drink was to be touched until the 4th day, and then only a soup made from maize flour. The priests themselves were sworn to perpetual chastity and abstinence, and those who went astray in these matters were burned or stoned to death. Their temples were encompassed with walls, and kept scrupulously clean. Golden trumpets, and bells with stone clappers, summoned the people to worship. 1798 At a lower stage of civilization we find human sacrifice already well established, on historic lines, where temples and priesthoods are still insignificant. Thus among the Tupinambos of northeastern Brazil there was practiced a form of sacrifice which recalls at once the rite among the Indian Cons and the better-known one in Mexico, so often described. Among the lower tribes the human sacrifice here figures as primarily an act either of propitiation of their own dead slain in war or of providing them with food in the other world, they having become gods in virtue of falling in battle, 1799 and, secondarily, as an act of sacrament. 1800 The Tupinambos and their congeners sought in battle not to slay but to capture enemies, and when they had a captive he was taken to their village in triumph and received with fife music, supplied by the bones of previous prisoners. For a whole year he was carefully treated, well fed, and supplied with a well-favored maiden as wife and servant. At length, on the day of the feast, he was adorned with feathers, and festily led to sacrifice, his body being immediately cut in pieces and distributed among the heads of houses or minor chiefs, or, otherwise, eaten in a general feast. 1801 If he had a child by his wife, it was brought up, as among the Cons, for the same fate. 1802 Of the more general usage of sacrificing children, which we have seen to be primordial in Central Asia, there are many traces among the North American Indians. Thus those of Florida at the time of the Spanish conquest are recorded to have sacrificed firstborn children to the sun, 1803 and in Virginia there was at times offered up the sacrifice of the only begotten son. More general seems to have been the simple usage of sacrificing boys to the god Oki and other deities. 1804 Oki was held to suck the blood from the left breast, and the theory of the sacrifice seems to have been that it secured good fortune in war. But there was practiced in addition an annual spring sacrifice, an instance of which is known to have occurred as late as 1837 or 1838, on the principle of ensuring a good harvest, the propitiated deity in this case being the great star, Venus. Prisoners were the usual victims, and the last and best known case is that of the sacrifice of a Sioux maiden, who was bound to a stake and slain with arrows. Before she died, pieces of her flesh were cut off in the horrible fashion of the cons, and the blood made to fall on the young seed corn. 1805 Next to a human sacrifice seems to have ranked, among some tribes, that of a white dog, the dog being for the Native American a valuable possession, 1806 and whiteness being held by them, as among the Greeks and Romans, a mark of purity and distinction in animals. Always it was something important or typically desirable that must be offered to the god. And in all cases the act of sacrifice seems to have lain near the act of sacrament, in which we know the identification of the god with the victim, whether as totem or otherwise, to have been a normal conception. The white dog, like the victim in the ancient Dionysiac sacrifice among the Greeks, seems at times to have been torn to pieces and so eaten. 1807 But there is an overwhelming amount of testimony to prove that among the Native Americans at the time of the Spanish conquest religious cannibalism was common. 1808 It was as a rule, perhaps, prisoners of war who were eaten, and it is recorded that when in the Florida War of 1528 famishing Spaniards were driven to eat the corpses of their own comrades, the Floridan natives, who were wont to eat their captives, were horror-struck. 1809, this though they had no agriculture, and fared precariously at all times. 1810 But though certain tribes were anthropophagous only on a war footing, there is only too much evidence in others that cannibalism occurred on other religious pretexts. 1811 And as all primitive feasts were more or less sacramental, and the sacramental eating of human flesh is seen to have subsisted among the Aztecs long after simple cannibalism had disappeared, there can be little doubt that originally the human sacrifice was eaten among the American peoples. Even in the savage stage, however, there can be traced the beginnings of the recoil not only from the sacrifice but from the cannibal sacrament. The letting of blood seems to have been in certain rites substituted for slaying, 1812 and in the story of Hiawatha the heaven god, who lived as a man among the Onondagas and had a mortal daughter, we find a parallel to the modified legends of Iphigenia and Jephthah's daughter. Heaven ordered that the maiden should be sacrificed, and her father sadly brought her forth, but there came a mighty sound as of a wind, and the people, looking on high, saw a dark object approaching with terrific speed, whereupon they all fled. The father and daughter stayed resignedly, and lo! The coming thing was an enormous bird, which hurled itself with such force on the maiden that she disappeared, and the bird was buried up to the neck in the earth. 1813 Late or early, the legend was framed with a purpose. In the tribal stage, necessarily, there was little development of the priesthood. Its beginnings were represented by the medicine men, or sorcerers, who set up secret religious societies or orders, to at least one of which, in the historic period, sorcerers of various types and tongues could belong. 1814 Of the temple, too, the beginning is seen in the sacred hut, to which in certain tribes only the king or the medicine man has entrance, and in which begin to be stored idols and sacred objects. 1815 As we go southward, towards the region of the higher civilization, we find an increasing development of the priestly function, sometimes in combination with the kingly, as among the Natchez of Florida, among whom in the 17th century was found the worship of the sun, symbolized in the hut temple by an ever-burning fire. 1816 There the king-priest was brother of the sun, and the royal family constituted an aristocracy with special privileges, though bound to marry outside their caste. 1817 In the Midway civilizations of Central America, this development has gone far towards the state of things seen in the kingdom of the Aztecs. In Yucatan, for instance, there was a hierarchy of priests, with a head, and the order seems to have had extensive judicial powers. 1818 The temples, too, had become considerable buildings, to which the leading men made roads from their houses. 1819 Alongside of the priests, all the while, remained the sorcerers or medicine men, also an official class with different types or orders, members of which, however, were privately employed by the nobles, 1820 after the manner of Levites among the early Hebrews, and these private priests competed with the hierarchy in the matter of receiving formal confessions from penitents and patients. 1821 convents existed for virgins, and of those who spent their whole lives in them the statues were after death worshipped as goddesses, while the king's daughter ranked as the fire virgin, and to her others were sacrificed. 1822 idols of all kinds abounded, and wooden ones, like the Hebrew teraphim, were accounted precious family heirlooms. 1823 human sacrifices, of course, were frequent, children being made victims in great numbers when captives were lacking, and legitimate sons when the sons of slave women ran short. 1824, not even the only son being spared. 1825 surrogate sacrifices in the form of bloodletting were normal, but the cannibal sacrament does not seem to have been so, though it took place in Guatemala, where the king and priests and nobles partook of the victims slain to the highest god at the time of Lent, the high priest and the king getting the hands and feet. 1826 in the case of this particular sacrifice, the chosen victims, who were slaves, were each allowed for a week the peculiar privileges accorded to similar victims in the Old World, down to the detail of dining with the king, and for this sacrifice, it is recorded, the victims were brought together in a particular house near the temple, and there got to eat and drink until they were drunk, apparently on the principles of the Cons and Rhodians. It seems now difficult to doubt that the religion of ancient America is of Asiatic derivation, and that the pyramidal altar temples of Mexico and Babylon are alike developments from simpler mounds or high places, shaped by the prehistoric peoples of Asia, who first carried the practice with them to the New World. It is now reasonably established that the mound builders of the Mississippi Valley were simply North American Indians, living very much at the culture stage of those found by the first whites, though there as elsewhere there may have been partial retrogression in certain tribes and territories under stress of war. 1827 from the tribal state, civilization had risen to a stage at which, in Central America, even outside the Aztec state, as in Yucatan, there were schools in the temples where the children of the priests and nobles were taught such science as the priests possessed, from books 1828 in which had been evolved a hieratic script on the basis of hieroglyphics, 1829 as in ancient Egypt. They had advanced far in agriculture, cultivating many plants and fruits, had numerous stone buildings, and excellent stone-paved roads, and had made some little progress in sculpture. But there had been no transcending of the primeval concepts of religion, and human blood flowed for the gods far more freely than in the state of savagery. The savage's happy hunting ground had been specialized into a heaven and a hell, 1830 the medicine man into a great priestly order. From his primitive symbolism had been evolved the sacrament of baptism, his simple sun worship had become a vast ceremonial, and in many territories the heathen had so far anticipated Christian civilization as to have established the practice of confession. But the stamp of primeval savagery, conserved by the spirit of religion, is clear through it all. There is no gainsaying the fundamental relationship of the lower and the higher cults. Around the civilizations of Peru and Mexico, at the time of the Spanish conquest, there stretched north and south a barbarism in which we know to have existed the germs of universal historic religion, human sacrifices constituting sacraments, beliefs in deities and spirits beneficent and maleficent, practices of prayer and witchcraft, ritual and worship, festival and ordinance, the whole in part conducted by the community as a whole, but guided by the soothsayers and sorcerers who are the beginnings of priesthoods. From such antecedents everywhere has all higher religion been evolved. 4. The Mexican cultus. When we turn from this stage of religious history to that of Aztec Mexico, the first and most memorable difference that faces us is the immense expansion of the power of the priests. If we can trust the Spanish writers, 1831 5,000 priests were connected with the principal temple in the city of Mexico alone, where there were in all some 600 temples, and where the total population was perhaps about 300,000, 1832, and all the cities were divided into districts placed under the charge of parochial clergy, who regulated all acts of religion. In this enormous strength of the priestly class we have the secret of that frightful development of religious delusion and its attendant atrocity which marks off Mexico from the rest of the world. The system was, of course, polytheistic, and, equally of course, it exhibits the usual tendency towards pantheism or monotheism, but the overwhelming priesthood necessarily perpetuated the separate cults. There were at least 13 principal deities, and more than 200 inferior. 1833 indeed, some reckon as high as 3,000 the number of the minor spirits, 1834 who would answer to the genii and patron saints of Europe, and it is obvious that in Mexico as in Christendom there must have been many varieties of religious temper and attitude. 1835 in many of the forms of prayer and admonition which have been preserved, 1836 we see a habit of alluding reverently to God, Teotl, or our Lord, without any specification of any one deity, and with a general assumption that the Lord loves right conduct. This universal God was in origin apparently the Son, who was worshipped in the temples of all the gods alike, being prayed to 4 times each day and 4 times each night. 1837 At the first glance it is plain that the Mexican pantheon represented the myths of many tribes, myths which overlapped each other, as in the case of the ancient and widely worshipped god of rain and his wife the goddess of water, and which survived separately by being adapted to the different usages of life. In connection with the rite of infant baptism, which the Mexicans practiced most scrupulously, the officiating women prayed to Our Merciful Lady, Calcayutlicue or Cihuacotl, the goddess of water. 1838 At the season when rain was wanted for the harvest, again, prayer was made to the god or gods named Tlaloc. 1839, for both the singular and plural forms are used, who controlled the rain, and whereas the goddess of water invoked at baptism was held merciful, the Tlaloc had to be propitiated by the regular sacrifice of a number of sucking infants, bought from poor parents or extorted from superstitious ones. 1840 There is no more awful illustration of the capacity of the human mind for religious delusion than the record of how the merciful people, believing in the efficacy of the sacrifice, would yet keep out of the way of the sacred procession which carried the doomed babes, because they could not bear to see them weep and think of their fate, while others, weeping themselves, would take comfort if the children wept freely, because that prognosticated plenteous rains. 1841 But even under the spell of religion men could not sacrifice infants to the very deity invoked at baptism, so the benign water goddess was sundered from the child-devouring water god. And by the same law of adaptation to social function it came about that the most prominent of the worships of Mexico, a state periodically at war, was that of the war god Huitzilopochtli, who figured as the patron god of the nation. In Huitzilopochtli we have a very interesting case of mythological evolution. 1842 It has been argued that he was originally a simple bird god, the hummingbird, his early name being the diminutive Huitziton, the little hummingbird. 1843 An old legend tells that while the Aztecs still dwelt in Aztlan, a man among them named Huitziton chirped like a bird, Tihue equals, let us go, and that he thus persuaded them to migrate and conquer for themselves a new country. As the later god actually bears the symbol of a hummingbird on his left foot, and his name Huitzilopochtli means, hummingbird on the left, there has evidently occurred some process of assimilation, but it is not quite certain that it was in this wise. If the hummingbird were originally a totem god, the hypothesis would seem sound, but this, I think, has not been shown, and there remains open the possibility that the symbol was not primary but secondary. The singular fact that, even as the Mexican war god has a hummingbird for his symbol, so Mars, the Roman war god, has a woodpecker for his, is in this regard worth a moment's attention. We can draw no certain conclusion in the matter, but it seems likely that the evolution in the two cases may have been similar. Now, there is no clear evidence that the woodpecker was a totem god, and the whole question of Mars's name Picumnus, which he was held to have from Picus, the woodpecker, is obscure. 1844 Oddly enough, the Sabines had a legend that the woodpecker led them to their settling place, which they consequently called Picenum. When we note that a number of ancient communities similarly had legends of birds or animals who guided them to their settling place, 1845, and that the name of the place sometimes accords with the name of the guide and sometimes does not, we seem obliged to recognize 3 possibilities. 1. The animal or bird was in some cases very likely a totem god, the legend of guidance being a late way of explaining its association with the community. 2. A place, however, might easily be named by newcomers because of the number of birds or animals of a given kind seen there, and the explanatory legend on that view is naught. 3. A symbolic animal, connected with the worship or image of a god, would also give rise to explanatory legends. One would prompt another. If then the Sabines put the woodpecker on their standard, the question arises whether it may not have been because it was the symbol of the war god. It is noted concerning the hummingbird that he is extraordinarily brave and pugnacious, 1846, and the same might readily be said of the woodpecker, who is as it were always attacking. Supposing the symbol to be secondary, there is no difficulty in the matter, all the legends would be intelligible on the usual lines of myth-making. In regard to Huitzilopochtli, again, there is a symbolic source for his curious epithet, on the left. In one legend he sits after death at the left hand of his brother Tezcatlipoca, 1847, the creator and supreme god, and whether or not this is the earliest form of the idea, it suggests that the placing of the symbol on the left foot of the war god may have arisen from the previous currency of the phrase, Huitzlin on the left, in another signification, though on this view the god had been already named after his symbol. Leaving open the problem of origins on this side, we come upon another in the fact that neither Huitzilopochtli nor Mars was primarily a war god. The former, who was practically the national god of Mexico, was also called Mexitli, 1848, and it seems likelier that this should have been his original name, and Huitzilopochtli a sobriquet, than vice versa. And so with the function. A war god, specially known as such, is not a primary conception. What happens is that a particular god comes to be the god of war. Among the Native Americans, the great god, or creator and ruler, or else the heaven or sun god, was the war god, 1849, and we know that Mars was originally a sylvan deity, 1850, concerned with vegetation and flocks and herds. How came he to preside over war? Simply because, we may take it, he was the god of the season at which war was usually made. Campaigns were begun in spring, and so the god of the spring season, who was specially invoked, became war god. Mars was just Martius, March, and he lent himself the better to the conception, because March is a stormy and blusterous month. Mars strictly retains these characteristics, being a blusterous rather than a great or dignified god in both the Greek and Roman mythologies. But here suggests itself another possible source for the symbol of the war god. Picas means speckled, 1851, colored, and the speckled woodpecker might figure the coming of speckled spring, as the hummingbird would do the color time in Mexico. Perhaps there may be a similar natural explanation for the further striking coincidence that Huitzilopochtli is born of a virgin mother, Coatlicue, who is abnormally impregnated by being touched by a ball of bright-colored feathers, 1852, while Juno bears Mars also virginally, being impregnated by the touch of a flower. 1853. In both cases, certainly, we have a sufficiently marked primary type for the myth of the virgin birth, the idea in each being simply the birth of vegetation in spring. Though the mythical Coatlicue, like Mary, is a God-fearing woman, who frequents the temple and lives in a specified village, Coatepec, near Tula, the Virgin Mother is simply the ancient mother of all, the earth, and the concept of virginity is a verbally made one, in virtue of the mere fact that the whole is a metaphor. But if Huitzilopochtli be thus admittedly in origin a god of vegetation, 1854, there arises a stronger presumption that he too was originally symbolized by his bird because of its seasonal relation to his worship. It is denied that in his case the seasonal explanation of the choice of Mars as war god can hold good, 1855, because the spring in Mexico is a time of heavy rains, when campaigns are impossible. In his case then the selection of the war god is presumably a result on the one hand of his symbol, which further seems to have been spontaneously made a symbol of the sun, 1856, and on the other hand of his special popularity, a constant feature in the cult of the vegetation gods. And when we note further that the chief god of the Caribs, Uluca, was represented with a headdress of hummingbird feathers, and that the Toltec god Quetzalcoatl, also a god of fruitfulness, was figured with the head of a sparrow, which was the hieroglyph of the air, 1857, we are led to surmise, not that all of these gods were originally bird gods, but that they were all originally spring gods or other nature gods to whom the birds were given as symbols, though the sparrow may have been originally a totem god. Throughout the whole of Polynesia, the red feather of one small bird, and the tail feathers of the man-o-war bird, the ordinary medium of extending or communicating supernatural power, and are regarded as specially pleasing to the gods. 1858. 5. Mexican sacrifices and cannibal sacraments. Of deeper interest is the moral aspect of the worship of Mexican gods, especially the most memorable feature of all, human sacrifice. Though this, as we have seen, is primordial in religion, there can be no question that its enormous development was the work of the organized priesthood, and of the cultivated religious sentiment. The Roman war god remained subordinate, warlike though the Romans were, the Mexican became one of the two leading deities, and received the more assiduous worship. Whence the divergence? Mainly, we must conclude, from the multiplication of the Mexican priesthood, which was primarily due to the absorption of the priesthoods of the conquered races, and from the prior development of the rite of human sacrifice in the cult of the gods or goddesses of vegetation. Among the Aztecs the tradition went that human sacrifices were of late introduction, 1859, and this view would no doubt be favored by the priests, who would represent that the latter-day power of the state was due to the sacrifices. But we have seen that they were practiced on a smaller scale by the American peoples at much earlier stages of social evolution, and in the midway stages they were also common. In northern South America, the chief god of the Muiscas, Fomagata, was worshipped with many human sacrifices, as he was also under the name Fomagazdad, with his wife Zapaltonal, in Nicaragua, where he and she were held the progenitors of the human race, 1860, and similar usages, often in connection with the sun god, sometimes with the god of rain, were common in Yucatan, Chiapa, Tabasco, Honduras, and elsewhere. 1861 The Mexican Otimias, also, who were not conquered by the Aztecs, sacrificed children and ate their flesh, carrying it with them, roasted, on their campaigns. 1862 Such sacrifices then were well established in Mexico before the Aztecs came, being found in some degree even among the relatively peaceful Toltecs. 1863 What the Aztec priesthood did was to multiply them to a frightful extent. 1864 The causes of expansion and restriction in such cases are no doubt complex, but when we compare those of the Aztecs and the Greeks, Egyptians, and Romans, we can trace certain decisive conditions. Firstly, human sacrifices tend to multiply among peoples much given to war, by way of offerings to the gods, but where there is only a limited priesthood the natural force of compassion leads men in time, as they grow more civilized, to abandon such sacrifices, while a priesthood tends to maintain them. Thus among the civilized peoples of the Old World they lasted longest with the priest-ridden Carthaginians, and the reason that they did not continue late among the Jews was probably that these did not possess a numerous priesthood till after the captivity, when their religion was recast in terms of the more civilized Oriental systems. On the other hand, an expanding or expanded empire, powerfully ruled by a warrior autocrat, like those of Babylon and Egypt, is led in various ways to abandon human sacrifice even if the priesthoods be numerous. Alien cults are absorbed for political reasons, and it is no part of the ruler's policy to be habitually at war with small neighbors, he having absorbed most of them, hence an irregular supply of captives. The priesthoods, too, can be conveniently provided for through other forms of sacrifice, and on those other lines they are less powerful relatively to the king. Thus in the empire of the Incas the practice of human sacrifice was well restrained. But where a warlike and priest-ridden state is established among well-armed neighbors, with cults of human sacrifice already well established all round, the sacrificing of captives is apt to serve as a motive to war, and the priests tend to enforce it. The process is perfectly intelligible. The stronghold of all priesthoods is the principle of intercession, whether it be in the form of simple prayer and propitiatory worship, or a mixture of that with a doctrine of mystic sacrifice, as among Protestants, or in the constant repetition of a ceremony of mystic sacrifice, as among Catholics, or in actual animal sacrifice, as among ancient Jews and pagans. In these cases we see that, the more stress is laid on the act of sacrifice, the stronger is the priesthood, or we may put it conversely. Strongest of all then must be the hold of the priesthood whose sacrifices are most terrible. And terrible was the prestige of the priesthood of Mexico. The greater the state grew, the larger were the hecatombs of human victims. Almost every god had to be propitiated in the same way, but above all must the war god be forever glutted with the smoking hearts of slain captives. Scarcely any historian, says Prescott, 1865, estimates the number of human beings sacrificed yearly throughout the empire at less than 20,000, and some make it 50,000. 1866 Of this doomed host, Huitzilopochtli had the lion's share, and it is recorded that at the dedication of his great new temple in 1486 there were slain in his honor 70,000 prisoners of war, who had been reserved for the purpose for years throughout the empire. They formed a train 2 miles long, and the work of priestly butchery went on for several days. At every festival of the god there was a new hecatomb of victims, and we may conceive how the chronic spectacle burnt itself in on the imagination of the people. The Mexican temples, as we have seen, were great pointless pyramids, sometimes of 4 or 5 stories, and the sacrifices were offered on the top. The stair was so made that it mounted successively all 4 sides of the pyramid, and when the train of torch-bearing priests wound their way up in the darkness, as was the rule for certain sacrifices, 1867 to the topmost platform, with its ever-burning fires and its stone of sacrifice, the whole city looked on. And then the horror of the sacrificial act. In the great majority of the sacrifices the victim was laid living on the convex stone and held by the limbs, while the slayer cut open his breast with the sacred flint 1868 knife, the ancient knife, used before men had the use of metals, and therefore most truly religious, and tore out the palpitating heart, which was held on high to the upsent but all-seeing sun, before being set to burn in incense in front of the idol, whose lips, and the walls of whose shrines, were devoutly daubed with blood. 1869. Apart from the resort to holocausts, the religious principle underlying many, if not all, of the American human sacrifices was that the victim represented the god, and on this score slaves or children were as readily sacrificed as captives. Among the Guatemalans, we are told, captives or devoted slaves were regarded as becoming divine beings in the home of the sun, 1870, and the general principle that the victim represented the god involved such a conception. 1871. And while this principle probably originates in early rites, such as those so long preserved by the Khonds, which aimed at the annual renewal of vegetation by propitiation and sympathetic magic, the practice became fixed in the general rituals as a sacred thing in itself. In connection with one annual festival of Tezcatlipoca, the creator and soul of the world, who combined the attributes of perpetual youthful beauty with the function of the god of justice and retribution, as winter sun, there was selected for immolation a young male captive of especial beauty, who was treated with great reverence for a whole year before being sacrificed, almost exactly like the doomed captive among the South American Tupinambos above described. He was gorgeously attired, flowers were strewn before him, he went about followed by a retinue of the king's pages, and the people prostrated themselves before him and worshipped him as a god. He was in fact, according to rule, the god's representative, and was described as his image. 1872. A month before the fatal day, new indulgences were heaped upon him. For beautiful maidens, bearing the names of the principal goddesses, were given him as concubines. At length came his death day. His honors and his joys were ended, and his fine raiment taken away. Carried on a royal barge across the lake to a particular temple, about a league from the city, whither all the people thronged, he was led up the pyramid in procession, he taking part in the ritual by throwing away his chaplets of flowers and breaking his guitar. Then, at the top, the 6 black-robed slayers, the sacrificial stone, and the horror of the end. And when all was over, the priests piously improved the occasion, preaching that all this had been typical of human destiny, 1873, while the aristocracy sacramentally ate the victim's roasted limbs. Along with the victim for Tezcatlipoca there was one for Huitzilopochtli, and they roamed together all the year. The latter victim was not adored, but he had the privilege of choosing the hour for his sacrifice, though not the day. He was called the wise Lord of Heaven, and he was slain, not on the altar, but in the arms of the priests. 1874. The goddesses, too, had their victims, women victims, and a maiden was regularly prepared for one sacrifice to the maize goddess Centiotl, the Mexican Ceres, somewhat as was the representative of Tezcatlipoca. Centiotl was the mother goddess par excellence, being named Tucoahua, the nourisher of men, and represented, like Demeter and so many goddesses of the same type, with a child in her arms. 1875. A tradition prevailed, too, that in her cult there were anciently no human sacrifices. But this is doubtful, and the explanation is as before, that anciently single victims were sacrificed, while among the Aztecs there were many. The woman who personated the goddess was sacrificed with other victims, 1876, and the slaying was followed by a ceremonial of an indescribably revolting character, the slayers flaying the victims and donning their skins. 1877. This hideous act is in all likelihood one of the oldest devices of religious symbolism, and it is a distinguished theologian who suggests to us that it is linearly connected, through the totemistic or other wearing of animal skins, with the biblical conception of the robe of righteousness. 1878. It is certainly akin to the practice of the Babylonian priests, who wore imitation fish skins as identifying them with the fish god, 1879, and to that of the Egyptian and other priests who wore the dappled skins of leopards or fawns as symbolizing the starry heavens, or robes without seam as symbolizing the cosmos. 1880. At bottom all ritualism is the same thing, a reduction of righteousness, in all sincerity, to make-believe. But the special and habitual atrocity of the Mexican cultus was the act of ritual cannibalism. This was strictly a matter of religion. After a captive had been sacrificially slain in ordinary course, his body was delivered to the warrior who captured him, and was by him made the special dish at a formal and decorous public banquet to his friends. It was part of the prescribed worship of the gods. That the Mexicans were not in the least cannibals by taste is shown by the fact that in the Great Siege by Cortés they died of starvation by thousands. They never ate fellow citizens, 1881 only the sacrificially slain captive. But only a great priesthood could have maintained even that usage. We have seen that such ritual cannibalism has existed at one time in all races, and obviously it must have originated in simple cannibalism, for men would never have begun to offer to the gods food that was primordially abominable to themselves. 1882 on the other hand, however, we know that cannibalism everywhere dies out naturally even among savages, apart from religion, as soon as they reach some degree of peaceful life, and even sooner. Among the native tribes of Lower California, though they are among the most degraded savages in the world, and given to various disgusting practices, the eating not only of human flesh but of that of monkeys, as resembling men, is held abominable. 1883 The Tahitians, who in warfare were murderous to the last degree, and practiced hideous barbarities, had yet evolved beyond the stage of public cannibal banquets, even the sacrifice of a man to the god being followed only by the pretended eating of his eye by the chief, 1884 and it was the priests who instigated what human sacrifices there were. So among the similarly cruel Tongans, cannibal feasts were rare, occurring only after battles, and being execrated by the women. Child sacrifices were also rare and special, and were being superseded by surrogates of amputated fingers. 1885 In each of these cases the priesthoods were little organized, 1886 hence the upward evolution. Among the Fijians, the Marquesans, and the Maoris, on the contrary, we find highly organized and cannibalistic priesthoods, 1887 and there we likewise find cannibalism and human sacrifices alike common. So, among the Khons, especially, instructed, priest was essential to the Maria sacrifice, and in China, where human scapegoat sacrifices were discredited and abolished between the 3rd and 2nd centuries B.C., we hear of them as being prescribed by priests and put down by wise rulers. 1888 And as in Peru we shall see reason to regard the Incas as putting some check on human sacrifice, so in the whole of Central America the only case of any attempt at such reform, apart from the Toltec priesthood of Quetzalcoatl, occurs in the history of the great Acolhuan king of Tezcuco, Netzahualcoyotl, who died in 1472. Of him it is told that he was the best poet of his country, which was the most highly civilized of the New World, 1889 and that he worshipped, on a great altar pyramid of 9 stages, an unknown god, who had no image, and to whom he offered only perfume and incense, 1890 resisting the priests who pressed for human sacrifice. But his example seems never to have affected his Aztec allies, who gradually won supremacy over the Tezcucans, and even in his own realm he could never suppress the human sacrifices which had there been revived before his time under Aztec influence, and multiplied under it later. The Aztec religion, in fine, was working the ruin of the civilization of Central America, as similar religions may have done for the far older civilizations that have left only ruins behind them. Sacerdotalism, it is clear, tended as an institution to check the progress of humanity, which even among slaughterous savages elsewhere brought anthropophagy into discredit. No amount of passion for war could have kept the civilized Aztecs complacently practicing ritual cannibalism if an austere and all-powerful priesthood had not fanatically enforced it. 1891 The great sanction for human sacrifice, with the Mexicans as with the Semites, was the doctrine which identified the god with the victim, and as it were sacrificed him to himself. The principle was thus in a peculiar degree priest-made and priest-preserved. 1892. 6. Mexican ethics. The recital of these facts may load some to conclude that the Mexican priesthood must have been the most atrocious multitude of miscreants the world ever saw. But that would be a complete misconception. They were as conscientious a priesthood as history bears record of. The strangest thing of all is that their frightful system of sacrifice was bound up not only with a strict and ascetic sexual morality, but with an emphatic humanitarian doctrine. If asceticism be virtue, they cultivated virtue zealously. There was a Mexican goddess of love, and there was of course plenty of vice, but nowhere could men win a higher reputation for sanctity by living in celibacy. Their saints were numerous. They had nearly all the formulas of Christian morality, so-called. The priests themselves mostly lived in strict celibacy, 1893, and they educated children with the greatest vigilance in their temple schools and higher colleges. 1894 They taught the people to be peaceful, to bear injuries with meekness, to rely on God's mercy and not on their own merits. They taught, like Jesus and the pagans, that adultery could be committed by the eyes and the heart, and above all they exhorted men to feed the poor. The public hospitals were carefully attended to, at a time when some Christian countries had none. They had the practice of confession and absolution, and in the regular exhortation of the confessor there was this formula: clothe the naked and feed the hungry, whatever privations it may cost thee, for remember, their flesh is like thine, and they are men like thee. Cherish the sick, for they are the image of God. And in that very same exhortation there was further urged on the penitent the special duty of instantly procuring a slave for sacrifice to the deity. 1895 Such phenomena carry farther challenge to conventional sociology. These men, judged by religious standards, compare closely with our European typical priesthood. They doubtless had the same temperamental qualities, a strong irrational sense of duty, a hysterical habit of mind, a certain spirit of self-sacrifice, at times a passion for asceticism, and a feeling that sensuous indulgence was revolting. Devoid of moral science, they had plenty of the blind instinct to do right. They devoutly did what their religion told them, even as Catholic priests have devoutly served the Inquisition. That is one of the central sociological lessons of our subject. The religious element in man, being predominantly emotional and traditional, may ally itself with either good or evil, and no thanks are due to religion, properly speaking, if it is ever in any degree identified with good. How comes it that Christianity is not associated with human sacrifice while the Mexican cultus was? Simply by reason of the different civilizations that went before. It is civilization that determines the tone of religion, and not the other way. Christianity starts with a doctrine of one act of human sacrifice, and Christians are specially invited each year at the sacred season to fasten their minds on the details of that act. Their ritual keeps up the mystic pretense of the act of ritual cannibalism which of old went with the human sacrifice. They harp on the very words, body and blood. They mystically eat the body of the slain god. Now this very act was performed by the Mexicans not only literally, as we have seen, but in the symbolic way also, and they connected their sacraments with the symbol of the cross. Of the Tlaxcalans it is told that at one festival they fixed a prisoner to a high cross and shot arrows at him, and that at another time they fastened one to a low cross and killed him by bastinado. 1896 In the sacrifice of a maiden to the maize goddess Centiotl above mentioned, the priest who wore the slain victim's skin stood with his arms stretched out, crosswise, before the image of Huitzilopochtli, so representing the goddess, and the skin, presumably stuffed, 1897 was hung up with the arms spread in the same attitude, and facing the street. 1898 The Mexicans, finally, had a festival in honor of Xuchitli, the god of fire, 1899 the crowning act of which was the making a dough image of the god, as was also done in the worship of Huitzilopochtli at the festival called Eating the God, and raising it on a cross, 1900 the image being then climbed for and thrown down, and the fragments eagerly eaten by the crowd as possessing a sacred efficacy. 1901 They felt they were brought into union with the god in that fashion. As has been above noted, there is some evidence that among the first Christians the Eucharist was sometimes a baked dough image of a child, 1902, and on any view the irresistible presumption is that in all cases alike the symbolical usage grew out of a more ancient practice of ritual cannibalism. Christianity coming among a set of civilized peoples, the symbol became more and more mystical, though the priesthood adhered tenaciously to the doctrine of daily mystical sacrifice. In Mexico, certain cults had similarly substituted symbolism for actual sacrifice, among the modifying practices being the drawing of a little blood from the ears and other parts of the children of the aristocracy. 1903 But the thin end of the wedge was in, so to speak, in the survival of actual human sacrifices, and the Aztec priesthood drove the wedge deeper and deeper, in virtue of their collective economic interest as well as of what we may term the master tendency of all religions, the fixation of ideas and usages. The more piety the more priests the more sacrifices, and the constant wars of the Aztecs supplied an unfailing stream of captives for immolation. 1904 Many wars were made for the sole purpose of obtaining captives. 1905 In fact, the Aztec kings made a treaty with the neighboring Republic of Tlaxcala and its confederates, a treaty which was faithfully kept, to the effect that their armies should fight on a given ground at stated seasons, in order that both sides should be able to supply themselves with sacrificial victims. At all other times they were quite friendly, and the Aztec kings avowedly kept up the relation purely in order to have captives for sacrifice. 1906 An arrangement like that, once set up, would flourish more and more up to the point of national exhaustion, especially as death in battle was reckoned a sure passport to paradise, and the priesthood would at the same time grow ever more and more numerous, the only limit being the people's power of endurance. There can be little doubt that the Aztec Empire would ultimately have broken down under its monstrous burden if the Spaniards had not destroyed it, for the taxation necessary to support the military and aristocratic system alongside of the allocation of enormous untaxed domains 1907 to the ever-multiplying myriads of priests was becoming more insupportable year by year, so that the deep disaffection of the common people was one of the chief supports to the campaign of Cortés. 1908 It may well be that some of the previous civilizations 1909 had succumbed in the same way, literally destroyed by religion, to the extent, that is, of inviting conquest by less civilized tribes. Among some of the Maya peoples, who preceded the Aztecs, the office of sacrificer had come to be regarded as degraded, 1910 but even there the sacrifices never ceased, and the Maya civilization failed to hold its ground before the others. Strangely enough, there was current among the Aztecs themselves a belief that their state was doomed to be overthrown. 1911 Here, doubtless, we have a clue to the existence of civilizing forces, and of a spirit of hostility to the religion of bloodshed which, however, felt driven to express itself in terms of despair. To this spirit of betterment, then, we turn with the doubled interest of sympathy. 7. The Mexican White Christ. Two sets of phenomena tell of the presence among the Aztecs of that instinct of humanity or spirit of reason which elsewhere gradually delivered men from the demoralization of human sacrifice. One was the practice, already noted, of substituting a symbol for the sacrificed victim. The other was the cultus of the relatively benign deity Quetzalcoatl, a god of the Toltecs whom the Aztecs had subdued. There is no more striking figure in American mythology. The name appears to have meant the feathered, or colored, serpent, and this was one of his symbols, but he was normally represented by the red-billed sparrowhead, which in Mexican hieroglyphics stands for the air, and his third symbol, the firestone, had the same significance. 1912 As god of the air, accordingly, he ranks in the pantheon. 1913 But his mythos has a uniquely ethical stamp, and a certain wistful pathos. 1914 It tells that he was once high priest at Tula, in Anahuac, where, ever clothed in white, he founded a cultus and gave beneficent laws to men, teaching them also the arts of agriculture, metalwork, stone-cutting, and civil government, the while a king named Humac held with him the secular rule, and framed the law book of the nation. But the god Tezcatlipoca came to earth in the guise of a young merchant, who deceived the king's daughter, and again in the guise of an old man, who persuaded Quetzalcoatl to drink a mystic drink, whereupon he was seized with an irresistible impulse to wander away. And so he went southeastwards, setting up his institutions in place after place, but always going further, till at length he disappeared in the east, with a promise to return. For that return his worshippers ever looked longingly, and the Aztec kings with fear, till when Cortés came all thought that he was the god, and at Cholula the people sacrificed a man to him, and daubed him with the blood in the regulation way. 1915 But in the myth of Quetzalcoatl it is told that at Tula he had preached against human sacrifices, telling men to offer to the gods only fruits and flowers, and that he could not endure the thought of war, closing his ears when men spoke of it. A similar doctrine is associated with the traditionary worship of the rival god Wotan, the legendary founder of the Maya civilization, 1916, and it may be that in both cases there is a reversion to the memory of simpler and kindlier cults. In any case, this humane legend figures for us a late product of Toltec feeling, representing at once the aspiration for a better religion and the memory of the Toltec people, whose polity had been step by step driven to the southeast by the stronger power of the Aztecs. 1917 It may have been some of the Toltec priests who remained under Aztec rule that framed the gentle mythos, 1918, and so dreamed for themselves a messiah, as so many conquered races had done before. On analysis, it appears that Humac was really the old Toltec name of the god, and that he took that of Quetzalcoatl in one of his more southerly resting places, when he became symbolized as the serpent. 1919 Of old he had had human sacrifices like other gods, and in the Aztec lands he had them still. 1920 But some of his white-robed priests, left victimless till they recoiled from the bloody rites of their conquerors, felt that their god must have a different nature from that of the gods of the black-robed priests of Tezcatlipoca and Huitzilopochtli, and so framed for his cult a new gospel. 1921 Recognizing this, Dr. Muller and Dr. Brinton and Dr. Reville agree that Quetzalcoatl is properly the god of the beneficent rain-bringing east wind, identified with the vanquished Toltec people, so that like them he is driven away by the enmity of other deities, but, like the vanishing or slain sun god of all mythologies, he is to return again in power and great glory. By such a myth Christians are set vaguely surmising a debt to their own legend, but there is no such thing in the case. As Mr. Bancroft observes, following Dr. Muller, 1922, the process is one which has occurred in many mythologies. It is everywhere the case among savages, with their national god, that the latter is a nature deity, who becomes gradually transformed into a national god, then into a national king, high priest, founder of a religion, and at last ends in being considered a human being. The older and purer the civilization of a people is, the easier it is to recognize the original essence of its national god, in spite of all transformations and disguises. So it is here. Behind the human form of the god glimmers the nature shape, and the national god is known by, perhaps, all his worshippers as also a nature deity. From his powerful influence upon nature, he might also be held as creator. The pure human form of this god, Quetzalcoatl, as it appears in the fable, as well as in the image, is not the original, but the youngest. His oldest concrete forms are taken from nature, to which he originally belongs, and have maintained themselves in many attributes. All these symbolize him as the god of fertility, chiefly by means of the beneficial influence of the air. 1923. What is specially interesting is that, despite the inner hostility of the Quetzalcoatl cult to those of the Mexican gods, his stood in high honor, 1924, and while some of his devotees sacrificed and ate his representative once a year in the usual manner, some of his priests, of whom the chief also bore his name as representing him, 1925, did as little sacrificing as they could, evidently finding some support in that course. 1926. We are moved to ask, then, whether there was here a culture force that could have countervailed the host of the priests of slaughter had the Aztecs been left to work out their own salvation. The more the problem is pondered, however, the less probable will it seem that the humane teaching could have so triumphed. Conquest by some other American people might have served to restrain the religion of blood, but there is no sign that the humane cult was as such making serious headway. The Aztec priesthood, like every other, had an economic basis. Its higher offices were the perquisites of certain aristocratic families, and the habit of perpetual bloodshed had atrophied the feelings of the priestly army on that side. Beyond a certain point, priesthoods are incapable of intellectual regeneration from within, even if reformative ideas be present. 8. The fatality of the priesthood. The main hope of the humane thinkers would probably lie in the substitution of a symbolic for an anthropophagus sacrament. If baked effigies could be eaten, effigies might be sacrificed. But in some even of the symbolic sacraments blood was a constituent. Thus in the cult of Huitzilopochtli, for the baked image made of seeds for the winter festival of the solstice, Christmas, the blood of slain children was the cementing moisture. 1927. Here again we have the primitive, sympathetic magic. The image, which was transfixed with an arrow before being eaten, represented the potentialities of new vegetable life at the time of year when vegetation was dead, and the blood of children was the deadly symbol of the moisture that was the life of all things, besides being a means of as it were vitalizing the image. 1928. Such a cult was indeed far from reducing anthropophagy to a mere symbol. So with the cult of Xiuhtli, the fire god. Alongside, apparently, of the remarkable symbolic sacrament above mentioned, there were anthropophagus sacraments to the same god. He was one of the most widely honored of all, the first drink at every meal in every household being taken in his name, a correlation which again suggests derivation from an Asiatic fire cult such as is seen blended in that of Agni in the Vedas. In his name, too, every child was passed through the fire at birth, another notable parallel to ancient Asiatic usages, 1929, and from his 600 temples burned as many perpetual fires. Every 4 years a great feast was held in his honor at Cuautitlan, not far from the city of Mexico, the first act being to plant 6 high trees before the temple on the day previous, and to sacrifice 2 slaves, who were flayed. On the feast day, 2 priests appeared clad in those victims' skins, hailed with the cry, "See, there come our gods," and all day they danced to wild music, the while many thousands of quails were sacrificed to the god. Finally the priests took 6 prisoners and bound or hanged them to the tops of the 6 trees, where they were shot through with arrows. When dead they were taken down and their hearts cut out in the usual way, the priests and nobility finally eating the flesh of both the men and the quails as a sacrament. 1930. It is not clear at what place and period the symbolical sacrifice in this cult arose, but the essential problem is whether it could have ousted the other. And the answer must be that inasmuch as the human sacrifice was specially associated with the power of the priests, and was obviously to the tastes of the mass of the people of all grades, nothing short of an overthrow of the existing polity by another could have effected the transformation, there being no native culture in the surrounding states that could give the requisite moral lead on a large scale. Such violent subversion, it will be remembered, was a common condition of religious evolution in the Old World in antiquity, and the history of the great, priestly systems of Egypt, India, and Babylon points to the conclusion that not otherwise than by the fiat of powerful autocrats, or forcible overthrow at the hands of neighboring and kindred races, in the absence of peaceful culture contacts of a higher kind, could such systems be made to loosen their grasp on social and intellectual life. It will be observed that in the cult under notice the priest represents the god even as does the victim. The same phenomenon occurs, sometimes, though not always, with the same procedure of donning the victim's skin, in many of the American sacrificial cults, Aztec and other. 1931. A recent hierologist has argued, in view of the various instances in which priest-kings and sacrificial priests have been themselves annually sacrificed, that it was as the shedder of divine victims' blood that the king-priest's blood was shed, and that he was originally distinguished from his fellow worshippers only by his greater readiness to sacrifice himself for their religious needs. 1932. We need not dwell here on the fallacy of thus imputing a calculated and reasoned self-devotion in the case of an act which, among savage men, would stand just as much for lack of imagination or forethought. Assuming the theory to be true, however, we must recognize that in the case of the historic Mexican priesthood any ancient liability of the kind had long disappeared. According to Herrera, the private chaplains of the nobles were slain at the death of their masters, but this was as slaves or attendants, not as public priests, and not as true sacrifices. 1933. In not a single case do we learn that the victim was furnished by the priestly class. 1934. The class indeed practiced in some measure, as we have seen, the asceticisms common to most ancient priesthoods, but it had long made an end of any serious penalties attaching to its profession. 1935. The priests, in short, were the dominant force in the Mexican society, and under them it was on the one hand being economically ruined in the manner of most ancient empires, and on the other being ankylosed in its moral and intellectual life. To say this is of course not to select the priests for blame as being the sole or primary causes of the fatal development, their order was but the organized expression of the general religious tendency. But they dramatically exhibit, once for all, the capacity of religion, in general to darken life and blight civilization. The mere number of the priests was so great as to constitute a force of fixation such as has never been countervailed in modern European countries, where forces relatively less powerful have only slowly been undermined by culture influences from more advanced neighboring communities. When we note that the temple of the Mexican wine god alone had 400 priests, 1936, we realize that we are in presence of social conditions which mere humanism could not avail to transform, even if it found a hearing among the priesthoods. A fortiori, no philosophic developments on the sacerdotal side could have availed. The growth of a pantheistic philosophy among the priesthoods of ancient India and Babylonia and Egypt, and the growth of a monotheistic doctrine among those of Jewry, were equally without effect on the sacerdotal practices as a whole, these remaining in all cases alike primitively sacrificial, though, for extra-sacerdotal reasons already noted, they ceased to include human sacrifice. And in Mexico, of course, the philosophic developments were slight at best. The figuring of Tezcatlipoca as the soul of the world, 1937, does not appear to have stood for any methodically pantheistic thought, being apparently an expression of henotheism common in solar worships. The entire Mexican civilization, in short, was being arrested at a stage below that attained in the Mesopotamian empires long before the Christian era. 9. The religion of Peru. While in Mexico we see a society being ruined by religion, in Peru we find one suffering economically a similar ruin from the principle of empire. In Peru, the religious tendencies are seen at work in a much modified degree. There the rapid multiplication of the priesthood was hindered by the peculiar standing of the king and his family. In Mexico the king was elected by the nobles, in Peru he reigned by divine right of the strongest description, the doctrine being that the original Inca was the sun god, who married his sister, and that all succeeding Incas did the same, thus keeping the succession strictly divine. As they extended their dominions by conquest, they astutely provided that the religions of the conquered peoples should subsist, but in a state of recognized subjection to the Inca, the divine high priest, as the priesthood generally ranked below the sacred caste of the Inca nobles, so that the old cults had not the chance of growing as those of Mexico did, though they remained popular and venerable. The two leading deities were Pachacamac and Viracocha, who in virtue of similarity were often identified. Each figured in myth as a creator, and they were doubtless originally the gods of different peoples or tribes, though their cults tended to unity under the politic despotism of the Incas. Pachacamac signifies life-giver of the earth, 1938, and Viracocha, who here assimilates to Aphrodite, foam of the sea, and they seem accordingly to have been respectively associated, to some extent, with the principles of heat and moisture, but, as so many other ancient systems show, these principles readily lend themselves to combination. Both belonged to the pre-Incarial civilization, but were adopted and blended by the Incas, though their status as creators of all things, including the sun, was inconsistent with the Incarial religion, in which the sun was the creator. 1939 The omission to build new temples, however, 1940 was probably undermining this cult, and the popular religion was becoming more and more one of worship of the minor deities, with the Inca figuring as the representative of the chief natural god, the sun. The thunder and lightning were worshipped as the sun's ministers, the rainbow as his symbol or emanation, and the moon and stars, and in particular the planet Venus, as separate divinities, and creator, thunder, and sun were sacrificed to as if very much on a level in dignity. 1941 From such developments we may infer that the Peruvian popular culture was nearly stationary or decaying, and it becomes easy to understand how, after the conquest, the Christian deities took the place of the old without any difficulty, these being so many religious conventions, while the real beliefs of the people remained attached, as they are now, to the genii or sprites of their own lore. For an unprogressing and unlettered people, as many of those in Europe have been at different times, religion is mostly a matter of festivals and hand-to-mouth superstitions, and the Peruvian common people are, under Christianity, what they were under their Incas. European life gives abundant evidence of how the usages of an ancient creed may survive the creed itself. In Peru, as in Mexico, there was a solemn religious ceremony of renewing at stated periods, by special generation, the fire used in the temples, and even in the households. In Mexico it was done over a human sacrifice, by means of the friction of two sticks, at the end of each cycle of 52 years. 1942 In Peru it was done yearly by means of a concave mirror. 1943 So did men do in ancient Rome, and similarly have northern European peasants done in Germany, in Scotland, in Ireland, at intervals till our own time, regarding the need fire, or forced fire, as a means of averting evil. 1944 It is one of the oldest rites of the human race, and it has survived under all religions alike down to the other day, when perhaps it received its death blow from the Lucifer match. Equally universal is that ceremony of annually driving out the evil spirits, 1945, which was undertaken in Peru by the Incas in person, and which is supposed to have survived in Scotland to this day in the Berghull ceremony of riding the marches. Customary usages and minor superstitions outlast faiths and philosophies, and in Peru they defy the church. Sun worship is gone, but the ideas of the Incarial times remain. And, indeed, there existed in some districts 80 years ago, and probably survives even today, a devout celebration of the memory of the ancient theocracy, in the shape of an annual dramatic representation, which the rulers vainly sought to suppress, of the death of the last Inca at the hands of the Spaniards. 1946 It was about as ill-founded a devotion as any ever shown to a royal line in our own hemisphere, for under the Incas the people were heavily oppressed by minutely tyrannous laws and by taxes, they alone bearing all burdens, and the priests and nobles going free. 1947 But were it not for the mistake of the last Inca before Pizarro in recognizing one of his sons by a foreign queen, and dividing the empire between him and the heir apparent, the Inca Empire, despite the disaffection of some of its subjects by conquest, might have subsisted long. As its priesthood was necessarily less powerful, so its sacrificial system was less burdensome and less terrible. Human sacrifices also were much less general than in Mexico, but they existed. 1948 And there is reason to reject the claim of Garcilaso, who was biased by his Incarial descent, that the Incas had wholly abolished them. Peoples at that culture stage could not readily be forced to give up their ancient rites. It is in fact on record that when an Inca was dangerously ill, one of his sons was sacrificed for him to the sun god in the immemorial fashion, 1949, and it was in keeping with such a usage that at least one tribe in Quito should regularly sacrifice its firstborn. 1950, if it be a sheer fable that at the accession of a new Inca there were sacrificed some hundreds of children. 1951, no trust can be put in any of the Spanish testimonies. It is however established by the fables and rites of the Incas, 1952, that the great festival of Capacocha or Cachilmaca, instituted by one Inca at the beginning of his reign, was celebrated with sacrifices of boys and girls, one from each tribe or lineage, both at Cusco and at the chief town of each province. Further, after every victory certain captives were sent to the capital to be sacrificed to the sun. It is thus only too likely that among some of the coast peoples children were sacrificed to the gods every month. 1953, what seems to be certain is that, save perhaps among some of the more savage tribes, the Peruvians under the later Incas had abolished cannibal sacraments, a proof of the natural movement of humanity in that direction where the direct interest of a powerful priesthood did not too potently conserve religious savagery. For the rest, they sacrificed their llamas, small birds, rabbits, sheep, and dogs, and while they alone of the American races had burnt offerings of animals, 1954 they ate their unburnt sacrifices raw, 1955 here again showing the tendency of religion to preserve, wherever possible, the most ancient usages of all. They had, indeed, the custom of sati, like the Hindus and the Mexican Chichimecs, good widows, especially those of the Incas, being at one time expected to bury themselves alive when their husbands die, 1956 so as to be wives to them in the spirit world. But this custom was dying out, being replaced by the symbolism of placing statuettes in a man's tomb to represent his wives and servants. 1957 in the same way, human sacrifice was being replaced by the surrogate of bloodletting. 1958 above all, the blood sacrament had become conventionalized in a quasi-Christian form. The Peruvians had the institution of a Holy Communion, in which they ate of a sacred bread, sanku, sprinkled with the blood of a sacrificed sheep, the priest pronouncing this formula, "Take heed how ye eat this sanku, for he who eats it in sin, and with a double will and heart, is seen by our Father, the Son, who will punish him with grievous troubles. But he who, with a single heart, partakes of it, to him the Son and the Thunderer will show favor, and will grant children and happy years, an abundance of all that he requires." All then made a solemn vow of piety and loyalty before eating. 1959 to say, as some do, that there was nothing essentially moral in such rites, because they had in view temporal well-being. 1960 is merely to set up one more one-sided discrimination between Christianity and paganism, for it is certain that the early Christians regarded their Eucharist as possessing miraculous medicinal virtues. Equally unjudicial is the comment on the rites of infant baptism and confession of sins, which the Peruvians also practiced, that, even where the Peruvian religion seems to undertake the elevation and protection of morals, it does so rather with a utilitarian and selfish view than with any real purpose of sanctifying the heart and will. 1961 It is hardly necessary to reply that the Mexicans and Peruvians had just the same kind of moral feeling in any given stage of civilization as Christians have had in a similar culture stage, and that the desire for future salvation, appealed to in all Christian evangelical teaching, is only utilitarianism and selfishness sub specie aeternitatis. The Spaniards themselves recognized that the Mexicans ate the mystical body of the god with every sign of devotion and contrition, 1962, and they were so far from depreciating the Peruvian communion that they supposed St. Bartholomew had established it. 1963 The Mexican wise woman who prayed the merciful goddess to cleanse the babe from the sin of its parents will compare fairly well with the practices of infant baptism among ourselves, and it cannot be shown that the Mexican and Peruvian confessors stood as a rule any lower morally than those of Christendom at the same culture stage. The casting of horoscopes for infants was practiced in Europe just as in Mexico at the time of the conquest. The Mexican priests gave indulgences, but they never went to the lengths of the Renaissance papacy in that direction. 10. Conclusion. On the other hand, the promotion of material well-being is precisely what is oftenest claimed for Christianity, and the argument is presumably changed in the case of Peru and Mexico only because there it would break down. For the great fact about these heathen civilizations is that they did attain material well-being, as apart from humane feeling, in a considerable degree, though, as we have seen, they were suffering much from sacerdotalism and autocracy. If we do not say with Dr. Draper that the Spaniards destroyed a higher civilization than their own, we may at least say that the one they destroyed was in many ways superior to that which they put in its place. What they did was completely to destroy the civilizations they found, without replacing them at all in large measure. In the matters of road-making, agriculture, and the administration of law, the new civilization was not to be compared with the old, which, indeed, was on these points ahead of anything in Europe since the fall of the Roman Empire. 1964 The Aztecs had clean streets and lighted streets, when Europe had not. Dr. Reville, indeed, lays undue stress on the lighting of the streets, which was not done by lamps, but by fires, 1965 but even that was an improvement on the European state of things 200 years ago. Peru today is in large part a desolation compared with what it was under the Incas, and under the new religion the native races seem to be positively lower than under the old. By the testimony of Catholic priests, the conquerors nearly exterminated the Aztec races, the numbers destroyed by their cruelties being reckoned at 12 millions. And on the side of morality and humanity, who shall say what the gain was in Mexico when the Christian conquerors, after execrating the practice of human sacrifice, set up their own holy inquisition to claim its victims for the propitiation of the three new gods, harrying still further the people they had already decimated by atrocious tyranny and cruelty. It is little to the purpose to urge, as was done by Joseph de Maistre, 1966, that the immense charity of the Catholic priesthood sought to protect the natives in every way from the cruelty and avarice of the conquerors. It is in the nature of all priesthoods in close connection with the people to seek or wish its good in some way. 1967 The Mexican priests, as we have seen, enjoined beneficence, and they treated their own vassals well. 1968 But when the Christian apologist declares that he has no knowledge of a single act of violence laid to the charge of the priests, save in the one case of Valverde in Peru, 1969 he goes far indeed beyond his brief. There were certainly humane priests, as Las Casas and Sahagan, but what but acts of violence were the whole efforts of the priesthood to destroy the ancient monuments and records, to say nothing of the operations of the Inquisition? It is not, however, in mere acts of violence that the fatality of Christian junction with non-Christian civilization lies. It belongs to the nature of the case, and religious principle, which encouraged the original act of conquest, is worse than powerless to avert the consequences. If the more forward races will not leave the more backward alone, and cannot blend with them in a common stock, they must do one of three things: exercise a mere supervision, good or bad, as Englishmen do in India, where they cannot breed, or crowd the weaker out, as is being done in North America and Australia, or strangle the lower civilization without developing the higher, as has been done in Mexico and Peru by Christians, and in Egypt by Saracens. Whether a race fusion can take place in Mexico, Peru, and Brazil remains to be seen. If it be attained, those countries will have solved the problem which in the United States, in a worse form, seems far from solution. In that case, a relative success may finally be claimed for the Catholic as against the Protestant evolution. But it will be due to other causes than religion. It may, indeed, be charged against the Catholic Church that its unchangeable hostility to the spread of knowledge has been the means of paralyzing progress in countries where, as in Mexico and Peru, it has been able to attain absolute dominion over minds and bodies. It seems hard, says Dr. Tyler, 1970, to be always attacking the Catholic clergy, but of one thing we cannot remain in doubt, that their influence has had more to do than anything else with the doleful ignorance which reigns supreme in Mexico. But it is not Catholicism that is the explanation. The only difference, avows Dr. Brinton, 1971, in the results of the two great divisions of the Christian world, in the matter of conquests, seems to be that on Catholic missions has followed the debasement, on Protestant missions the destruction, of the race. It may be added that in Protestant Natal today there is a general determination among the white population to keep the natives uneducated, lest knowledge should give them power. In fine, the claim that there is an inherent civilizing virtue in Christianity is here, as elsewhere, turned to confusion. Christianity, as the same writer declares, 1972, has shown itself incapable of controlling its inevitable adjuncts, and it would have been better, morally and socially, for the American race never to have known Christianity at all than to have received it on the only terms on which it has been possible to offer it. What Christendom could best have done for the American civilizations, after putting down human sacrifice, was to leave them to grow, like those of China and Japan, under the influence of superior example at certain points. Progress might then conceivably have come about. 1973 There is little use in speculating over the it might have been, but at least we should not overlook the fact that in Peru there are distinct records of rationalism among the theocratic Incas themselves. Several of these remarkable rulers 1974 are recorded to have expressed the conviction that the sun, forever moving in his allotted course, could not be the supreme deity he was said to be, that there must be another deity who ruled him. 1975 Quetzalcoatl, we saw, thought similarly. This reminds us that in all ages and under all religions there have been free thinkers, men who knew that the gods were myths while the Vedic hymns were being made, Sadducees among the Jews, Mutazilites among the Mohammedans. For the history of mental evolution has not been that of a simple process from delusion to rationalism, but of a constant war between the two tendencies in the human mind, and what has happened hitherto is just that inasmuch as the majority have thought little they have been credulous. To measure the position of any nation in this regard, we have for the most part simply to consider the status and expansive power of its priesthood. And for us today there is one special lesson to be drawn from the case of the unbelieving Incas, who never modified their theocratic practice as regarded the multitude, whatever they might deem among themselves. Their principle evidently was that the masses must be deluded. Well, we know that when the royal line fell, those masses were wholly unable to act for themselves, and fell abjectly under the sway of a mere handful of conquerors. Unless the masses also rationalize, they will never attain a worthy humanity. So that the free thinkers had need be more righteous than the scribes and Pharisees. It is the more necessary to insist on this, the final lesson of all comparative hierarchology, because in the face of all the facts some students contrive, with the best intentions, to invert it. Because supernaturalism has always been associated with ethics in religious history, it is fallaciously inferred that there can be no ethic without supernaturalism, and in order to shield from rational criticism the prevailing creed, emphasis is laid on every point at which in its evolution it has chanced to be associated with the principle of betterment. This was the point of view of one of the first scientific investigators on the comparative principle, Benjamin Constant, whose treatise De la Religion, Consideri dans sa source, ses formes, ses développements, published in 1824-34, is still worth attention. Developing the principles of Fontenelle and Desbrosses, he set forth, clearly and insistently, 2 generations before Mr. Lang, the presence of savage survivals in the religions of civilized antiquity, 1976, and while accepting Hume's demonstration of the priority of polytheism 1977, he anticipated Mr. Lang's theorem about the good supreme being who could not be squared, 1978, even as he framed a number of the theses employed by Dr. Jevons for the vindication of religious intuitionism, such as the utility of taboo and the opposition between religion and magic. 1979, long before it was fashionable to do so, he adopted and developed Lessing's thesis of the progressive development of all religion, 1980 Comte's law of the 3 stages he anticipated by one of 4 stages, which is perhaps better grounded, 1981, and some of his solutions are both ingenious and just, more just than some of those of his successors who follow similar lines. Yet by reason of his desire to glorify the religious sentiment, in the abstract and in the present time, apart from all the forms of religion, he repeatedly lapses into crude sophistry. After insisting that the religious sentiment is universal, he speaks of irreligious peoples, 1982, and wherever he has to admit that religion has wrought tyranny and evil, he alleges that just there the religious sentiment has left it, that it has become merely interest, egoism, calculation. 1983, on this very principle, religion is beneficent only momentarily, when it is taking shape as a reform of old religion by innovators, each innovation in turn becoming a matter of form, interest, egoism, calculation, so that the religious sentiment, so far from being universal, turns out to be the sentiment only of innovators, free thinkers, enemies of traditionalism. After being represented as sweet and consoling for the mass of men, the spirit of religion turns out to be precisely what the mass of men never at any one moment entertain. All the while, it is pretended on a priori grounds that rationalism must always lend itself to fatalistic submission, as if religious reform were not relative rationalism, and the colossal historical facts of religious fatalism, religious tyranny, religious cruelty, religious license, are glozed as phenomena of irreligion. From this long-drawn contradiction there is only one way of escape, the recognition that the sole rational test of any religious credence or usage at any moment is its truth, relatively to the intelligence of the moment. Mechanically repeating that religion is a fundamental sentiment, men lose sight and hold of the truth that veracity is also a sentiment, with inalienable rights. The men who, in terms of religious credences, have reformed religion in the past, have done so in the conviction that the credences they discarded were not true. To argue that, because their credences were associated for a time with moral or material improvement, we must cherish those credences even when we know them to be untrue, is to be false not only to their ideal but to the very principle of development. Such an acceptance is in itself corruption, the negation of betterment, and to turn the historic fact of the relativity of religious beliefs into a general vindication of religion is to read the law of evolution backwards. Bad or mistaken morals are relatively fit, even as is false belief. It has been argued that cannibalism once saved the human race, and the proposition may be perfectly true, but so far from being an argument for reversion to cannibalism, it does not even cancel the fact that cannibalism has again and again gone far to destroy low civilizations. Religious belief has been historically associated with both the progress and the paralysis of civilization, and the just inference is that, so far from its being the principle of betterment, it is simply a form of fallacious mental activity which may either be countervailed by truer forms or may countervail them. And the beliefs which have the worst concomitants are precisely those certified by the special pleaders as truly religious. The belief in immortality, so often extolled as a great source of consolation, has been the motive for the slaughter of unnumbered millions of human beings, religiously doomed to accompany others to another world. The conception of sacrificial salvation, another source of blessed comfort, has incited to the slaughter of uncounted millions more, with every circumstance of heart-searing atrocity. The doctrine of sacramental communion with deity, as we have seen, has been the means of conserving and sanctifying systematic cannibalism at the hands of priesthoods, where without priesthoods it must have died out, and in every age and stage of human growth the religious sentiment, of which the most essential and constant characteristic is to cling to forms, is seen on the intellectual side damning new thought, strangling science, sanctifying injustice, and haloing war, as well as endorsing what measure of moral principle had been evolved in a lower stage of thought. There is never the slightest security that the spirit of justice and reason and sympathy will coincide with the spirit of religion, and there is no known religious system which is not habitually turned to the frustration of some of the best of the precepts it professes to inculcate. There is thus no reason to doubt that in savage as in civilized times the forces of organized religion have been arrayed against the forces of betterment, social as well as intellectual, with but a dubious record on the side of moralization. Certain hierologists on religious grounds make much of the fact that some of the lowest races appear to have the highest notions of a supreme being, as if that were not especially plain proof of the futility of theistic notions as civilizing forces. Fijian religion, we are told, draws an impassable line between ghosts and eternal gods, 1984, and the apparent effect of that discrimination was to keep the Fijians the most revolting set of cannibals on the face of the earth, 1985, habitually eating their own species because the eternal gods preferred so to feed, while in the mysteries of their supreme being there were scenes of almost incredible indecency. Precisely where men drew the least clear distinction between ghosts and eternal gods, that is to say among the Tongans, cannibalism was abandoned till Fijian influence revived it, and the position of women was immensely better. 1986, and all the while, the more brutal the religion, the more complacent were the worshippers. The unconscious testimony of a missionary may help to make the point clearer. The religious system of the Samoans differs essentially from that which obtained at the Tahitian Society and other islands with which we are acquainted. They have neither maras nor temples nor offerings, and, consequently, none of the barbarian and sanguinary rites observed at the other groups. In consequence of this, the Samoans were considered an impious race, and their impiety became proverbial with the people of Rarotonga, one of the Hervey Islands, for when upbraiding a person who neglected the worship of the gods, they would call him a godless Samoan. But this people had a lords many and gods many, 1987, and the belief in these, by the missionaries' account, was associated with vice and absurdity. As between the Samoan and the Fijian, our sole test is the critical reason. It is by the same test that we pronounce given religious doctrines incredible or inconsistent, apart from any question of their effects. Let that criticism be honestly met on its own ground, instead of by way of paralogisms concerning the utility of false beliefs in the past, and hierology will be freed from an element of disturbance and distortion, becoming as nearly as possible a department of pure history. It is the tactic of the special pleader for religion that has introduced that element. It lies with him to let it vanish. Doubtless it will reappear in sociology, but there it will be for the time a quickening force, giving vitality to a science that is slow to be vivified by actual interests.